Hey guys, tonight we are heading back to the wide open grasslands of the ancient world to answer a question you have probably wondered about at least once. Likely at a barbecue, possibly at 2 in the morning while doing something completely unrelated. Why did people start smoking weed? Not eating it baked into something by a nervous friend who swears it is only a little bit strong. Not rubbing it into sore joints as a tincture. Smoking it. Inhaling actual smoke on purpose for the effect, as a group activity, at a funeral of all places. Because the honest answer is not modern, and it is not Californian, and it is not even remotely recent. The answer takes us to the Iron Age steppe, somewhere around the 5th century before the Common Era, to a nomadic people called the Scythians, who lived on horseback, drank fermented mare's milk for breakfast, buried their dead with an alarming amount of gold, and somewhere in the middle of all that grieving, apparently figured out that if you throw hemp seeds onto red-hot stones inside a small felt tent, something rather interesting happens to the room. And to you. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here, and leave a comment telling me where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Because there is a non-zero chance someone out there is watching this on a lunch break, which, respectfully, is a choice. Now dim the lights, put on a fan for that soft forgettable hum, get yourself horizontal, and let's drift into the grasslands together. Let's sit with a few questions for a moment, the kind you have never asked out loud, but have absolutely wondered at some point in your life, probably around question 3 of a pub quiz you were losing badly. Did ancient people really get high on purpose? Or did somebody just back into it by accident and then never bother explaining themselves to history? What exactly does it mean to howl with pleasure inside a smoke tent? And are you prepared to hear a 2,400-year-old Greek historian use that phrase completely unironically? How do you make alcohol out of horse milk? And more importantly, why on earth would you? Did nomads ever bathe? Even once under any circumstances, or was hygiene simply not on the syllabus? What does it take to felt an entire house out of wool while your neighbours are simultaneously packing theirs onto a wagon? And when your whole tribe uproots and moves every few weeks? What exactly happens to the one guy who is always running late? We are going to answer every single one of these tonight, slowly, thoroughly, and in considerably more detail than is strictly necessary before bed. Congratulations, you have just woken up on the Eurasian steppe, somewhere in what will one day be southern Russia or Kazakhstan, sometime around 450 BCE, inside a felt tent that smells faintly of horse, faintly of wood smoke, and faintly of a lifestyle no dermatologist would ever recommend. You have no fixed address, no plumbing, and an alarming number of horses who outrank you socially. Let's find out how you got here, and more importantly, how you are supposed to survive it. Consciousness arrives the way it always does out here, not gently, but all at once, delivered by a combination of cold air on your face and the specific felted darkness of a tent that has no windows, because windows were never really the point. The doorway of the tent is never placed carelessly, oriented deliberately away from the prevailing wind, and by broader steppe custom, often facing generally toward the sunrise, a small piece of architecture that quietly insists morning is coming whether you feel ready for it or not. It is kept low and narrow on purpose, forcing anyone entering or leaving to duck. A minor daily indignity that exists purely so precious heat does not spill straight out into the dark every time someone decides, at some deeply inconvenient hour, that they urgently need to step outside. Sleeping position inside the tent follows its own quiet hierarchy too, elders and the household head generally settled toward the rear, opposite the door. The position considered warmest and safest, while younger family members and anyone lowest in the pecking order end up closer to the draft. A seating chart nobody ever announces out loud, but that everyone somehow understands perfectly by the time they are old enough to have an opinion about it. You have long since stopped resenting your current spot near the door, mostly because you remember, vividly, being younger and colder and considerably further from the fire, and you know your turn toward the warm side is coming. Eventually, the same slow way it comes for everyone who simply outlives enough relatives ahead of them in line. Neighbouring families pitch their own tents at a respectful, customary distance, close enough for quick help in an emergency, far enough that ordinary household noise does not become everyone's business, an unspoken zoning code enforced entirely through habit rather than any formal survey or property line. You can generally judge a family's relatives standing within the tribe by the placement of their tent within the wider camp, positions nearer the chieftain's own household considered more prestigious. A subtle social geography that everyone reads instinctively, without a single person ever needing to explain the rules out loud. Even the pegs and lashings holding the tent frame together get inspected each time the household resettles, a stretched cord replaced before it snaps mid-storm, rather than after. Since out here maintenance is never treated as optional busywork, but as the quiet difference between a house that survives the season and one that does not. Visitors from a neighbouring household passing through in the early morning can generally guess, just from the particular quality of smoke curling up through your tent's roof hole, whether the fire inside was tended well overnight or allowed to nearly die. A small, involuntary piece of information broadcast to the entire camp before anyone has said a single word to their neighbours. You are lying on a floor of packed felt mats, layered thick enough to keep the worst of the ground's chill from climbing directly into your spine, though not thick enough to stop it entirely, because nothing here is ever quite enough, only just enough to survive, which is a very different standard. Above you, the roof of the gur, or yurt if you prefer the word history, eventually settled on, rises in a shallow dome of bent willow poles lashed together and stretched over with layer upon layer of felted sheep and goat wool. Dense enough to shed rain, dense enough to trap a surprising amount of warmth, and dense enough to make you wonder every single morning whether you are waking up inside a house or inside a very large, slightly damp sweater. The air smells like a campfire that has been slowly dying all night, mixed with the distinct, unmistakable musk of livestock, because somewhere just outside, and sometimes not even outside, animals have spent the night close enough to hear breathing. There is a central smoke hole at the very peak of the roof, a small circular opening you can angle open or shut depending on the wind, and it is doing its honest best to let the hearth smoke escape, though honest best and actual success are, as always, two very different things. A thin blue haze hangs at head height, which means the correct sleeping posture, learned quickly by every child on the step, is to stay low, because standing up too fast is how you learn what a smoke-cured lung feels like before your 10th birthday. You sit up slowly. Everything around you is round. The tent is round, the hearth in the centre is round, the felt cushions scattered near the walls are round, and this is not an accident. A circular structure sheds wind the way a river stone sheds current. No flat wall for the step gusts to slam into and rattle, just a smooth, low profile that lets the wind slide past rather than through. Your ancestors did not need an engineering degree to figure this out. They needed one particularly bad storm and a strong desire to still have a house the next morning. The felt itself deserves a moment of respect, because you are, quite literally, living inside laundry. Someone in your family, probably several someones, spent days beating raw wool with sticks, soaking it, rolling it, and dragging it behind a horse across the ground until fibres that started as loose fluff had matted themselves into a dense, windproof, rain-shedding fabric strong enough to be a wall. Modern insulation comes from a factory. Yours came from repetitive stress injury and a horse's willingness to drag things. Around you, the rest of the household is stirring in stages, not all at once, because someone always has to be the first fool awake enough to deal with the fire. That job usually falls to whichever elder or child drew the short straw the night before, and this morning it is not you. which means you get an extra 30 seconds of lying very still under your felt blanket, listening to the specific creak of willow poles settling as the wind outside picks up. Deciding today's temperature before anyone has been consulted. There is no alarm clock, obviously, no soft chime easing you awake at a reasonable hour. There is only light, filtering faintly grey through the smoke hole, and sound. The low stamp and snort of horses picketed nearby, who have apparently decided that your sleep schedule is now their business too. A horse does not care that you were up late the night before. A horse wants breakfast, and a horse has hooves, and a horse is not afraid to use them against the side of the tent to make a point. Getting dressed is a briskly practical affair. You reach for felt boots lined with wool, trousers cut for riding rather than walking, because walking is what happens on the rare. Unfortunate day your horse is unavailable, and a long wool or leather tunic belted at the waist, the whole ensemble designed by generations of trial and error to keep a body warm while spending roughly 16 hours a day on horseback. There is no mirror, there is no need for one. Nobody here is checking whether their outfit says anything about them except, perhaps, whether it says I am prepared for weather that wants to kill me, which frankly is the only fashion statement that matters. Compare this for a moment to your own mornings, fumbling for a phone before your eyes are even open, checking a screen that tells you the exact temperature outside before you have committed to leaving a climate-controlled bedroom. Here, the temperature check is simpler. You step toward the door flap, pull it back an inch, and let the step itself answer the question, usually somewhere between bracing and openly hostile. There is no snooze button on a continent-sized weather system, and there never will be. By the time you have fully surfaced, the hearth has been coaxed back to life. Someone is already outside dealing with animals who have very strong opinions about breakfast timing. And the tent itself, which felt like a cocoon 20 minutes ago, has already begun the daily process of being disassembled in your mind. Because out here, home is never a place. It is a shape you carry with you, folded onto the back of a wagon, ready to be rebuilt wherever the grass looks slightly greener tomorrow. You have not even had breakfast yet, and already the day is demanding more from you than most modern people manage before their second cup of coffee. Let's talk about bathing, because you are going to need to substantially lower your expectations, starting immediately and continuing indefinitely. Certain plants get pressed into service as a kind of rough approximation of modern personal care, wormwood and other pungent steppe herbs crushed and rubbed against skin, or hung inside the tent to discourage insects, a fragrant, faintly bitter substitute for anything resembling a scented soap. Wounds and minor skin complaints get treated the same practical way. Poultices of chewed or crushed plant matter pressed against a cut or a burn, knowledge passed down almost entirely through observation and repetition rather than any written manual. Tested the hard way across countless winters by people who did not have the luxury of a pharmacy to fall back on if the first remedy failed. Felt itself occasionally doubles as the closest thing you have to a towel, a rough scrap kept specifically for wiping down after the rare, celebrated occasion when you do manage a proper wash in a summer stream, and it dries about as well as you would expect a piece of matted wool to dry, which is to say slowly, and with a smell that lingers regardless of how recently the stream water actually touched it. Winter brings its own particular hygiene compromise, since the cold makes even a quick rinse in melted snow a genuinely risky proposition, and most households simply accept a longer stretch without any water contact at all, layering on more smoke, more grease, and considerably more resigned humour about the whole situation. Summer, by contrast, at least offers the occasional real opportunity. A shallow, sun-warmed stretch of river, where children splash and shriek while adults stand nearby, half watching, half enjoying a rare, genuine moment of something resembling modern recreational bathing. Brief as it inevitably is before someone remembers the herd needs attention again. Older relatives sometimes trade knowing looks over just how quickly the younger generation adapts to the smell, the smoke, the general lack of anything resembling a modern bath, a running, good-natured joke about how nobody really complains for long, mostly because complaining changes absolutely nothing about the weather or the water supply. The specific mixture of smoke and animal fat that clings to your clothing eventually becomes, oddly enough, something close to a scent you can identify blindfolded as belonging to your own particular household rather than a neighbouring one. Each family's fire, animals and habits combining into a faint, distinct signature that takes a surprisingly short time to stop noticing, and an even shorter time to miss if you are ever separated from it. There is no bathhouse waiting for you this morning, no steaming basin, no bar of soap sitting hopefully on a shelf. Water out here is a resource for drinking, for animals, and for cooking, strictly in that order of priority, and personal hygiene occupies a distant, largely theoretical fourth place that mostly gets addressed by accident, usually when you fall into a river while fording it with the herd. Rivers and streams are seasonal, sometimes frozen solid for months, sometimes reduced to a muddy trickle in the dry season, and either way, nobody is stripping down for a leisurely soak when the water temperature could double as a murder weapon. Your actual hygiene routine, such as it is, revolves around smoke rather than water. Every night you sit close enough to the hearth fire that the smoke works its way into your hair, your clothes and your skin, and over time this becomes, somewhat horrifyingly, an effective strategy. Smoke dries out moisture, discourages some insects, and gives you a distinct, ever-present aroma that your entire community shares, which means nobody actually notices it anymore. The same way you stop smelling your own house after living in it long enough. You have become, functionally, a walking, breathing piece of smoked meat, and you have made an uneasy peace with this. Then there is the animal fat. Fat rendered from sheep or horses gets rubbed into skin during the brutal winter months, not for glow or radiance in the way a modern skincare advertisement might promise, but because a thin layer of grease genuinely helps block wind and retain a bit of warmth against exposed skin. It is essentially sunscreen and moisturiser and windbreaker rolled into one deeply pungent package, and if you think your own skincare routine is complicated, imagine explaining to a dermatologist that step 1 is rendered mutton fat. Teeth get some attention at least, mostly through the simple mechanical act of chewing tough, dried, sinewy meat for hours a day, which does a surprisingly decent job of scraping away build-up, the same rough logic behind giving a dog a chew toy. There is no toothbrush, no mint flavouring, nothing resembling modern dental care, and yet archaeological evidence from step burials shows people who, while certainly not winning any beauty pageants, were not exactly falling apart either. Hard living apparently comes with a few unintended benefits, alongside several thousand intended miseries. Hair is another matter entirely. Long hair, often braided or bound, gets washed rarely, if at all, and lice are less an occasional nuisance and more a permanent, unelected member of the household. Fine-toothed combs, carved from bone or antler, get passed around for grooming sessions that double as social bonding time. The Iron Age equivalent of sitting in a salon chair, except the stylist is your sister, and the topic of conversation is which neighbouring clans seem suspicious this season. You learn to accept the itching the way you accept the wind. As background noise your body eventually tunes out, mostly. Now imagine explaining any of this to a modern person standing in a shower, with hot water on demand, 3 kinds of exfoliating scrub, and a routine involving more products than the average step household owns in total. You would have to describe an entire life built around the idea that clean is a spectrum, not a state, and that the goal on any given day is not fresh, it is functional. Nobody out here is trying to smell like a meadow. Everybody out here is trying not to freeze, not to starve, and not to get thrown from a horse, and against that particular scoreboard, body odour loses every single time. There is admittedly a certain communal honesty to it. When every single person around you smells roughly the same combination of smoke, animal fat and horse, the concept of personal odour stops being embarrassing and starts being simply atmospheric, like weather. Nobody whispers about it. Nobody brings deodorant as a gift. You would sooner comment on someone's breathing than their smell, because both are just facts of shared existence. Background conditions of being alive on the step together. Clothing gets worn for extended stretches, sometimes seasons, before any serious washing occurs, because wool takes days to dry properly in a climate that alternates between bone dry and suddenly aggressively wet. And wet felt in a cold wind is a genuinely dangerous proposition, not a mild inconvenience. So garments accumulate a certain lived-in character, shall we say, that would set off every alarm in a modern laundromat, and everyone simply lives with it. The way you live with your car making a strange noise you have decided not to investigate. By the standards of your own morning shower routine, involving a loofah, 3 bottles of product, and roughly the same volume of hot water an entire step encampment might use for cooking in a week, this all sounds like a horror story. By the standards of the people actually living it, it is simply Tuesday. They are not aiming for spotless. They are aiming for still alive by nightfall, and on that particular metric, a bit of horse smell and a colony of lice barely register as a footnote. It's time for breakfast, and no, that does not mean cereal. Your first meal of the day depends almost entirely on one animal, and it is not the one you might expect. Sheep and goats provide meat for special occasions and disasters, but the horse is the true engine of steppe nutrition, and this morning, breakfast most likely means fermented mare's milk. A thin, tangy, faintly fizzy liquid that has been quietly turning itself into something resembling alcohol in a leather sack overnight, whether anyone asked it to or not. Salt, when your household actually has some, gets treated with a seriousness that borders on reverence, a small, carefully guarded supply traded at real cost from merchants who source it from distant salt flats or coastal operations. Sprinkled sparingly over meat, or stirred into a portion of curds, rather than shaken freely the way a modern cook might season a dish without thinking twice. Bowls and cups are carved from wood, horn, or occasionally hollowed bone, each one a small personal possession carried from camp to camp rather than replaced. And a cracked or lost bowl is a genuine minor tragedy rather than an excuse to simply buy another one from a cupboard full of spares. You drink from yours without much ceremony, the horn cup warm from your own hands, the rim worn smooth by years of exactly this same grip, a small, unremarkable object that will likely outlast you and end up, eventually, passed on to whichever younger relative needs one most. Meals are eaten seated on the ground around the low central hearth, everyone gathered close enough that conversation flows easily between bites, no separate dining room, no assigned seating beyond the general understanding of where elders and honoured guests belong relative to the fire. Manners exist, quietly enforced through observation rather than explicit instruction, and a child who reaches for more than their fair share before an elder has eaten learns the lesson quickly, through a sharp look if they are lucky, or a light smack on the hand if the point needs making more firmly. A particularly good breakfast, one with actual traded bread alongside the usual curds and kumis, gets remembered and mentioned for days afterward, a small genuine highlight in a routine that otherwise repeats itself with a steadiness modern audiences might call monotonous, and steppe dwellers simply call reliable. A truly skilled cook within the household develops small tricks for making the limited repetitive ingredients feel at least somewhat varied, a different order of boiling, a particular way of searing meat over the coals. Small variations that matter enormously to morale even when the underlying ingredients never actually change from one week to the next. You reach for a wooden bowl, and someone ladles in a portion from a large hide bag hanging near the tent entrance, one that has been sloshing gently for hours as people walked past and, out of habit rather than ceremony, gave it a stir or a punch on their way by. This is kumis, and it is less a drink than a project, a living, fermenting relationship between milk, wild yeast and thyme. And every household's batch tastes slightly different depending on how it has been tended. The step equivalent of a sourdough starter passed down with fierce, if slightly sour, pride the taste hits you sideways, sour like yogurt left out too long, faintly sweet underneath, and carrying a low, persistent fizz that tickles the back of your throat. It is mildly alcoholic, somewhere in the range of a light beer, which means breakfast on the step comes with a small, socially acceptable buzz that nobody considers remotely unusual. Mostly because water quality out here is unreliable at best, and mildly fermented milk is, counterintuitively, often safer to drink than the alternative. Imagine explaining to your boss that you are running a little behind because breakfast took the edge off, and somehow, out here, that excuse would actually hold up. Alongside the kumis, if you are fortunate, there might be a handful of dried curds, hard little chunks of pressed and dried milk solids called something resembling karut in later step traditions, chewy enough to double as both breakfast and a genuine test of jaw strength. You gnaw on one while walking toward the horse lines, and it slowly softens in your mouth, releasing a salty, tangy flavour that is somehow both deeply unappetizing and, after enough mornings of eating it, completely normal, the way anyone eventually stops noticing the taste of their go-to-breakfast bar. Grain, when it appears at all, is a rare and treasured import rather than a staple, traded from settled agricultural neighbours to the south in exchange for livestock, hides, or the occasional intimidating display of mounted archery. You are, after all, a nomad, not a farmer, and farming requires the one thing your entire lifestyle actively avoids, which is staying in one place long enough for crops to grow. So bread, when it shows up, is an event, savoured slowly, rationed carefully, treated with the reverence modern people reserve for genuinely good chocolate. Meat rounds things out on better mornings, usually left over from the previous night, cold, tough, and eaten with your hands and a knife. No utensils, no napkins. Nothing but confidence and good teeth. Horse meat, mutton, sometimes the meat of an animal that did not survive a rough night. Nothing goes to waste out here, because waste is a luxury reserved for people who are not one bad winter away from starvation. You learn quickly that turning your nose up at food is a habit you simply cannot afford. And that hunger, as it turns out, is an excellent seasoning. There is a strange kind of efficiency to this diet that a modern nutritionist would probably find fascinating and mildly alarming in equal measure. Milk, meat and blood, sometimes drawn carefully from a living horse in small, sustainable amounts during lean periods, cover an enormous range of your caloric and nutritional needs without a single vegetable in sight. An entire population thriving, more or less, on what modern wellness culture would call an aggressively unbalanced diet, and what the steppe simply calls Tuesday. Compare this to your own breakfast, poured from a box, printed with cartoon characters, eaten standing at a counter while scrolling a phone. Out here, breakfast is fermented, sour, faintly intoxicating, and directly connected to an animal you can currently hear breathing 20 feet away. There is no cereal aisle, no choice between 17 brands of oat milk, only the bag hanging by the door and whatever mood the yeast inside it happens to be in this particular morning. You drink it anyway, because the alternative is not eating, and out here, that is never really an alternative at all. Now it's time to actually produce that breakfast, which means someone has to milk the horses, and this morning, that someone is you. Children are introduced to milking gradually, starting not with mares at all, but with the comparatively forgiving goats and sheep, who tolerate clumsy, inexperienced hands with far more patience than any horse ever will. A kind of graduated apprenticeship that lets you build confidence and technique before you are ever trusted anywhere near a mare's considerably more dangerous hind legs. By the time you finally graduate to horses, you already understand the basic rhythm, though nothing quite prepares you for the specific, sudden violence of a mare's kick. delivered with a speed that makes it functionally impossible to dodge once it has actually started, which is precisely why every experienced herder teaches the same lesson early and often. Approach from the correct angle, stay alert, and never, under any circumstances, assume today's mare will behave the same way yesterday's did, because horses, much like people, are allowed to simply have a bad day. A skilled milker develops a reputation within the household that carries real, practical weight, since a mare handled calmly and confidently produces more milk more reliably than one approached nervously by someone she does not entirely trust. And over years of practice you begin to recognise the specific tells: a flattened ear, a shifted hip. The particular quality of stillness that separate a mare about to cooperate from one about to make your morning considerably more difficult. This quiet accumulated expertise rarely gets formally praised, but everyone in camp knows exactly whose hands they would rather have working a nervous, first-time mother, and that reputation, unspoken as it is, functions as its own kind of currency. Herders occasionally name individual mares, not out of sentimentality exactly, but because keeping dozens of animals straight during the daily milking rounds is considerably easier with names than without. A practical bookkeeping system that happens to look, from the outside, remarkably like genuine affection. A young rider assigned to the milking rounds for the very first time is usually paired deliberately with the most patient, forgiving mare in the herd, a small mercy extended by whichever elder assigns the day's chores, since starting a child off against the herd's most temperamental animal would likely end the lesson, and possibly the child's enthusiasm, considerably faster than intended. Milking a mare is nothing like milking a cow, and anyone who tells you otherwise has never stood behind one with a bucket and a prayer. Cows are, relatively speaking, patient, docile creatures who have made an ancient peace with being milked. Horses have not signed that same treaty, and a mare on the open steppe retains every bit of the instinct that makes horses excellent at fleeing predators and considerably less excellent at standing still for a stranger tugging at her udder before the sun has even fully cleared the horizon. The process starts with the foal, because a mare will not reliably let down her milk without her baby nearby, so someone leads the foal up first, lets it nurse just long enough to trigger the flow, and then, in a manoeuvre requiring genuine speed and no small amount of nerve, gently pulls the foal away and slides in to finish the job yourself, before the mare fully registers what has happened. It is, essentially, a bait and switch performed on a 1,500-pound animal with strong opinions and the physical ability to end your career as a nomad in a single, well-placed kick. You crouch low beside her flank, close enough to feel the heat radiating off her body in the cool morning air, close enough to smell the warm, grassy scent of horse, mixed with dew still clinging to her coat. Your hands, already stiff from the cold, work quickly, a rhythmic squeeze and pull that experienced herders make look almost lazy, and that you, on your first several dozen attempts, make look like a fight you are actively losing. Mares' udders produce far less milk per session than a cow's, which means the entire operation has to be repeated many times throughout the day, every few hours. Milking small amounts again and again rather than one large haul, an endless low-grade chore stitched into the entire rhythm of your daylight hours. Someone nearby, almost certainly a woman, since milking on the steppe falls overwhelmingly to women and older children, calls over a piece of advice you did not ask for, and desperately needed anyway. Something about keeping your weight balanced so a sudden sideways step does not send you sprawling into the dirt, bucket and all. You adjust your stance. The mare shifts, unimpressed, and swishes her tail directly into your face, which you choose to interpret as encouragement rather than commentary. Every so often, a mare simply decides she has had enough, and the entire operation ends abruptly, with a kick, a bolt, or a bucket sent flying spilled milk soaking into ground that will not appreciate the gift. and you standing there recalculating your entire morning. There is no OSHA out here, no safety briefing before you begin, only the accumulated hard-won wisdom of everyone who milked mares before you, most of it delivered as a scar, a limp, or a story told with a laugh several years after the actual incident stopped being funny. The horses themselves are not just livestock in the way you might picture cattle back on a modern farm. They are transportation, wealth, status, war machines, and now, apparently, breakfast, all wrapped into a single temperamental package that your entire society has organised itself around. A wealthy family might own dozens, even hundreds of horses, and a portion of the herd is always designated specifically for milking, chosen carefully, monitored closely, treated with a mixture of practical affection and business-like calculation that would feel familiar to anyone who has ever managed a small, unpredictable, occasionally dangerous workforce. By the time you have made your rounds among several mares, your fingers ache with a specific repetitive strain that no amount of complaining will fix, because tomorrow morning demands the exact same routine, and the morning after that, and every morning for the rest of your life on the step. There is no milking machine coming to save you. There is only you, the bucket, a mare who tolerates you at best, and the quiet understanding that out here, breakfast is not something you buy. It is something you earn, one nervous, well-timed squeeze at a time, while trying very hard not to lose a finger in the process. Let's talk about what happens to that milk after it leaves the bucket, because the journey from mare to mouth involves a fermentation process your average modern brewer would find both fascinating and slightly terrifying. The wooden paddle used to stir and churn the fermenting milk is such a fixture of daily step life that entire communities centuries later, far to the east, will eventually name settlements after it. The word for this specific churning stick, surviving into modern Central Asian languages and lending its name to what is today the capital city of Kyrgyzstan, a small, strange thread connecting your own daily chore directly to a skyline of buildings that will not exist for well over 2,000 years. You reach for that same kind of paddle now, plunging it into the sack and working it up and down with a steady rhythm, feeling the milk inside thicken and shift under the motion. A chore so utterly routine to you that the idea of an entire city eventually being named in its honour would probably strike you as one of the stranger things you have heard all week, right up there with talking, disembodied boxes and horseless carriages, neither of which you have any particular reason to imagine. Guests arriving in camp are almost always offered a bowl of kumis as a first gesture of hospitality, extended before any real conversation even begins, a ritual so deeply ingrained that refusing it outright would register as a genuine, borderline, insulting breach of etiquette rather than a simple dietary preference. You have watched more than one wary, unfamiliar traveller visibly relax the moment that first bowl is placed in their hands, understanding correctly that its offering signals safety and welcome, rather than any lingering suspicion, a small fermented handshake extended across whatever distance or difference otherwise separates host from stranger. A batch of kumis gone slightly too far, left unstirred and untended for a stretch longer than usual, turns sharply sour and gets repurposed rather than wasted, mixed into cooking or fed to animals, since even a fermentation experiment that overshoots its intended flavour still counts, out here, as a resource rather than a mistake. Certain households take genuine, quiet pride in a kuma's recipe, refined slightly differently from their neighbours, a touch more agitation, a particular vessel favoured over another, small variations defended with surprising conviction whenever the topic happens to come up around a shared fire. The freshly collected milk gets poured into a large leather sack, traditionally made from a horse's own stomach or hide, stitched tight and hung near the entrance of the tent or lashed to the side of a cart, positioned exactly where anyone passing by will bump into it, which as it turns out is the entire point. Wild yeasts and bacteria, already living in the leather itself from countless previous batches, get to work almost immediately. And what starts as ordinary milk begins its slow transformation into something considerably more interesting. Fermentation on the step is not a precise science involving thermometers and airlocks. It is a communal, almost accidental process that depends heavily on agitation, meaning someone has to stir or churn the mixture regularly throughout the day. And the traditional method for doing this is refreshingly low tech. You hit it. Or rather, everyone who walks past the hanging sack gives it a firm punch, a stir with a wooden paddle, or a good hard shake. An ongoing, informal chore distributed across the entire household simply by virtue of proximity. Nobody schedules a stirring shift. You just do it because the bag is right there, and idle hands are apparently the yeast's best friend. Over the course of several hours, sometimes a full day depending on the temperature and the mood of the local microorganisms, the milk sours, thickens slightly, then thins again as fermentation breaks down the milk sugars, releasing a light carbonation and a small but genuine amount of alcohol, typically somewhere in the range of 1 to 3%, enough to notice. Not enough to end your afternoon early, though a full day of steady sipping could absolutely change that equation. The final product is kumis, pale, cloudy, faintly effervescent, and smelling like a cross between yoghurt and the inside of a barn, which, to be fair, it more or less is. Taste it fresh from a new batch and you get something mild and only lightly sour. Taste it from a sack that has been going for days, continuously topped up with fresh milk the way a sourdough starter gets fed, and you get something considerably more assertive, tangier, more carbonated, with a kick that announces itself. Different families develop reputations for their kumis the same way modern neighbours might quietly judge each other's home cooking, and a particularly well-regarded batch might get shared proudly with guests, a small sour point of household pride in a life that offers precious few opportunities for bragging rights. Beyond the pleasant fizz and mild buzz, kumis serves a genuinely important nutritional role, providing calories, protein, and a reasonable amount of vitamin C at a time and place where fresh fruit and vegetables are essentially non-existent for most of the year. Fermentation also happens to make the milk safer to drink and easier to digest than it would be fresh. Breaking down lactose in a population that historically had varying tolerance for it, a happy biochemical accident nobody on the step understood scientifically, but everybody understood practically, in the way that only surviving something repeatedly can teach you. Consider, for a moment, your own relationship with fermented beverages, purchased in a bottle with a label, a brand, an expiration date printed in tiny font. Here, fermentation is not a product. It is a living presence hanging by your front door, tended communally, punched affectionately by whoever walks past, and consumed at every meal without a second thought about proof percentage or pairing suggestions. There is no sommelier. There is only the sack, the yeast, and the collective. Ongoing experiment of turning horse milk into something your entire tribe drinks before most of you have technically finished waking up. By mid-morning, the previous day's batch is well underway, gurgling faintly in its leather home, and a fresh round of this morning's milk has already been added to keep the cycle going, an endless rolling fermentation that never really starts or stops, only continues, the same way the sun never really starts or stops crossing the steppe sky. You take another long drink, feel the familiar fizz and tang settle over your tongue, and get on with your day slightly pleasantly buzzed, which, by the standards of any modern workplace, would raise a great many uncomfortable questions during the 9 a.m. Meeting, let's talk about horses again. Because on the steppe you never really stop talking about horses, and this time the subject is you, specifically, and the fact that you have been expected to ride since roughly the age most modern children are still working out how stairs function. Saddles here are simple but effective, a padded leather or felt seat cinched over a wooden frame, without the rigid stirrups later riders across Eurasia will eventually adopt. which means balance and grip come almost entirely from your own legs and core rather than from any mechanical assistance. A demand that builds a particular kind of core strength most modern gym goers would need months of dedicated training to approximate. The horses themselves are compact, shaggy, and remarkably tough, closer in build to the wild primitive horse populations that still roam parts of Central Asia than to the sleek, long-legged animals bred centuries later purely for speed and show. And what they lack in elegance they more than make up for in sheer, stubborn endurance. Capable of covering huge distances on rough grazing that would leave a more delicate, refined breed thin and exhausted within days. Falling from a horse remains a genuine hazard well into adulthood, and even the most accomplished riders in camp carry old injuries, a permanently stiff shoulder, a leg that aches predictably before a storm, quiet physical ledgers of decades spent trusting an animal that occasionally, without warning, decides not to be trusted back. Nobody treats these injuries as a mark of shame or failure. If anything, a rider entirely without scars by middle age draws a bit of good-natured suspicion, as though they have simply not been riding hard enough to have earned any yet. By the time you can ride confidently at a full gallop, your legs have developed a particular bowed strength that any modern physical therapist would recognise instantly. A permanent, visible signature of a childhood spent almost entirely on horseback rather than on solid ground. Falling off during early riding lessons stops feeling humiliating remarkably fast. Mostly because everyone around you fell exactly as often at the exact same age, and there is a kind of communal amnesia at work here. Adults who clearly remember their own childhood tumbles, somehow managing to look only mildly sympathetic, rather than smug when yours happens in front of them. Children here are placed on ponies almost as soon as they can sit upright unassisted, often tied loosely to the saddle with a strip of felt or leather so a stumble does not become a tragedy, and led around the camp perimeter by an older sibling or a patient grandparent, while the rest of the household goes about its business as though this is the most unremarkable thing in the world. Because out here, it genuinely is. By the time a modern toddler is being praised for successfully using a spoon, a stepchild is already developing the specific muscle memory of a body learning to move in rhythm with a horse's gait. An education delivered not through lessons but through sheer, repeated, bruising exposure. You remember, or you will remember, because this morning you are experiencing it fresh. The first genuine ride without someone holding the lead rope, the terrifying, thrilling sensation of a horse choosing its own pace beneath you while you cling on with knees that have not yet learnt the correct grip. Hands tangled in a mane that smells like dust and salt and effort. There is no round pen with soft sand underfoot, no helmet, no instructor calling out gentle corrections from a safe distance. There is only open ground, a horse who has decided you are, at best, a mildly interesting weight, and the very real possibility that you are about to become extremely well acquainted with the ground. Falling is not treated as a catastrophe, mostly because it happens constantly, to everyone, and the correct response, modelled enthusiastically by every adult around you, is to get up, spit out whatever grass or dirt you have inhaled, and get back on, before your legs have time to convince your brain that this is a reasonable moment to quit. Bruises are simply part of the currency of growing up out here, worn without complaint, occasionally compared with something almost like pride, the step equivalent of children showing off scraped knees from a playground. Except the playground is an entire continent, and the monkey bars can throw you off at a full gallop. By your early teenage years, riding has stopped being a skill you consciously think about at all, and has become something closer to breathing, an extension of your own body that lets you cover in a single day what it might take a person on foot the better part of a week to travel. This matters enormously, because your entire society, its herding, its hunting, its warfare, its trade, its very ability to migrate ahead of a hard winter depends on every single member being capable, competent, and largely fearless in the saddle. A steppe warrior does not learn archery and then learn riding. They learn them together, simultaneously, as a single unified skill, because a bow is useless if you cannot control the horse beneath you while drawing it, and a horse is only half as useful if you cannot fight from its back. Consider, for a moment, how your own society handles the transition to independent mobility, a car with airbags, a driving instructor, a written test, a supervised period of practice before you are trusted alone on the road. All of it wrapped in institutional caution, accumulated over decades of careful safety regulation. Out here, the equivalent milestone arrives around age 4 or 5, delivered with considerably less paperwork and considerably more risk of concussion, and somehow, against every modern instinct screaming that this seems needlessly dangerous, it works. Because a society that genuinely cannot function without universal riding competence simply does not have the luxury of waiting until everyone feels ready. Girls ride as readily as boys here, a detail that surprises people raised on certain assumptions about ancient gender roles, because herding, migrating, and yes, on occasion fighting, all require the same skill regardless of who happens to be doing it. And Greek writers, who later encountered steppe women mounted, armed, and entirely capable of holding their own in a fight, found the whole arrangement so unsettling that they built an entire mythology around it, imagining an entire tribe of warrior women living somewhere just beyond the next river, when the reality was considerably less mythical and considerably more mundane. Out here, a girl who cannot ride is simply a girl who cannot function, and nobody has the patience to entertain that particular limitation. The horses themselves are smaller and stockier than the elegant, long-legged animals you might picture from a modern racetrack, built more like a compact, all-terrain vehicle than a sports car, capable of surviving on rough grass through a brutal winter and covering enormous distances at a steady, ground-eating pace day after day without collapsing. You do not so much own a horse out here as enter into a lifelong working relationship with one, learning its particular quirks, its particular moods, the specific way it likes to be approached, the same way you might learn to read a difficult co-worker you happen to be permanently, physically tethered to. By the time you reach adulthood, the horse beneath you has become less a vehicle and more a limb, an extension of intention that responds to shifts in your weight and pressure from your knees so subtly that an outside observer might struggle to identify exactly what signal you gave before the animal wheeled, stopped, or surged forward. This is not a skill you can fake. It is not a skill you can rush. It is built, slowly and painfully, from thousands of small falls and thousands of small recoveries, starting at an age when a modern child is still being praised for not falling off a couch. And if that does not earn a small measure of respect from anyone currently white-knuckling their way through a beginner's riding lesson at 40, frankly, nothing will. Let's talk about where your house actually comes from, because it did not arrive from a factory, and it certainly did not arrive quickly. Beyond plain, practical felt for walls and boots, some pieces get decorated with real artistry, dyed in earthy reds, blues and blacks derived from local plants and minerals, then cut and appliqued into the same swirling animal motifs that show up in your tribe's metalwork and tattoos, stags, griffins and predators, locked in dramatic combat, stitched onto saddle covers, wall hangings, and ceremonial garments with a level of skill that takes years to develop properly. Wool itself comes from sheep specifically suited to this harsh environment, hardy, double-coated animals bred over generations to survive brutal winters on thin grazing, their coarse outer coat and softer undercoat both put to use. The coarser fibre often reserved for the toughest, most weather-beaten felt panels. The finer wool saved for anything meant to sit closer to skin. A finished felt panel gets inspected carefully before it is trusted as natural wool, held up to the light and checked for thin patches or gaps where fibres failed to bond properly, since a weak spot discovered mid-blizzard rather than during inspection is a mistake nobody wants to make twice. repairs happen constantly, and without much fuss, a fresh layer of wool worked into a worn patch, an edge re-rolled and retreated, the whole panel treated less like a finished product and more like an ongoing, living piece of infrastructure that simply never stops needing attention, not unlike a modern homeowner's endless list of small repairs, except considerably less optional given what happens if you skip one. A poorly felted panel that fails during its very first storm becomes, uncomfortably, a lasting bit of family reputation, remembered and gently mocked for seasons afterward, which is precisely why nobody rushes the rolling and trampling stage, no matter how tired their legs have become. A finished piece of felt, once trusted as a wall panel, gets marked in some households with a small woven or stitched symbol, identifying which family produced it. Useful both as a point of quiet pride and as a practical way to sort out whose panel is whose when several households happen to be felting side by side during a particularly busy stretch of the season. Felt is, at its core, wool that has been persuaded, through moisture, heat, pressure, and a considerable amount of stubborn repetition, to abandon its individual fibres and lock together into a single, dense, matted fabric, and the process of getting there is a genuinely full-body undertaking that involves most of the household working together for days at a stretch. It begins with shearing, pulling thick handfuls of wool from sheep who tolerate the indignity with varying degrees of patience, and continues through a laborious process of cleaning, beating and separating the fibres until you have a great airy cloud of raw wool that looks, at this stage, absolutely nothing like a wall. That cloud gets spread evenly across a large woven mat or hide, layered carefully in crisscrossing directions the way you might layer plywood for strength. And then, in the step that involves the most people and the most noise, it gets soaked with hot water, sometimes mixed with a bit of soured milk or urine to help the fibres bond, a detail modern felting hobbyists tend to leave out of their charming craft tutorials. The whole soggy mass is then rolled tightly around a wooden pole, bound with rope, and dragged, kicked, rolled, and trampled across the ground, sometimes by hand, sometimes literally behind a horse, for hours, while the fibres gradually tangle and lock into something resembling actual fabric. Children get roped into this process early, because rolling and stomping a felt bundle does not require advanced skill, only stamina and a willingness to spend an entire afternoon walking in circles on top of something wet and heavy, while adults periodically check the progress and declare it not quite ready yet. It is, in essence, the Iron Age equivalent of a barn raising, except instead of a single day of hammering, it stretches across multiple days of soaking, rolling, checking, adjusting, and occasionally arguing about whether the felt has been rolled enough or whether someone is simply trying to get out of their share of the work. The finished product is remarkable by any standard, water-resistant enough to shed a genuine rainstorm, dense enough to block a howling wind, and light enough that an entire family's worth of wall panels can be rolled up and loaded onto a single cart when it comes time to move. There is no equivalent material in your own life that you have made yourself, by hand, over several sweaty days, using nothing but wool, water, and the combined effort of your entire extended family, and if there were, you would probably think twice before letting a rogue campfire spark anywhere near it. Beyond the walls of your tent, felt shows up everywhere. Boot linings, saddle pads, hats, blankets, even the padding beneath armour, because a material this versatile does not get wasted on housing alone, when it can also keep a rider's feet warm on a freezing patrol, or cushion a saddle for a horse who has strong opinions about comfort. Every household produces its own felt continuously, a rolling, never quite finished project that restarts every time a new lamb is sheared, which means the work of making your house never technically stops, it just changes pace depending on the season. There is a particular kind of camaraderie that develops during a felting session, dozens of hands working the same soggy bundle, someone inevitably slipping and falling into the wet wool to general unkind laughter, an elder calling out instructions that everyone half listens to because they have heard this exact speech every single felting season of their entire life. Gossip flows freely during the long hours of rolling and trampling, complaints about neighbours, speculation about upcoming marriages, arguments about whose turn it is to fetch more hot water, the entire event functioning as much as a social occasion as a practical chore, not unlike a modern group of friends gathering to help someone move apartments. Except this move happens roughly every few weeks for the rest of your natural life. Compare the effort involved here to your own experience of acquiring shelter. A phone call, a lease agreement, a moving truck rented for an afternoon. Out here your walls are grown from a sheep's back, beaten into submission by your own family's hands and feet, and rebuilt from scratch with fresh material on a rolling basis for as long as you live. It is exhausting, it is tedious, and it produces against every reasonable expectation one of the most genuinely effective pieces of climate-appropriate architecture the ancient world ever devised, engineered entirely through trial, error, and the patient, repetitive stomping of several generations of tired, damp, mildly annoyed children. Let's talk about what happens to that lovingly felted home of yours, because the answer, distressingly often, is that you take it apart. The carts themselves deserve a mention here, since ancient Greek writers who encountered steppe peoples occasionally described entire households travelling inside wagons so substantial they amounted to houses on wheels, multi-wheeled platforms large enough to carry a felt structure fully assembled and ready for habitation, drawn by a team of oxen rather than dismantled and rebuilt at every stop. Your own household favours the more common approach, breaking the yurt down completely and packing the components separately, but wealthier families and certain subgroups within the wider steppe world do maintain these larger rolling homes, an impressive, if considerably less flexible, alternative that trades daily assembly labour for sheer, lumbering convenience. Assuming the terrain ahead is flat and forgiving enough to actually accommodate something that large. Livestock get moved separately from the main household caravan on strike day, driven ahead or alongside by riders who know the coming route well enough to keep the herd from wandering into trouble. And coordinating the timing between slower cart traffic and faster moving animals takes real, practiced skill, since arriving at the new campsite with your house but without half your sheep would represent a uniquely frustrating kind of failure. Elders often serve as the tribe's institutional memory for exactly this kind of logistics, recalling which routes flooded during a particularly wet spring decades earlier, or which shortcut saves a full day of travel if the ground is dry enough to risk it. Pack animals occasionally balk entirely partway through loading, planting their feet and refusing to move another step. And the correct response, learned through considerable trial and error, is patience rather than force, since an animal pushed past its limit on a moving day tends to remember the experience unkindly for weeks. The very first cart loaded on a moving day is always the one carrying the household's most valuable or fragile items, positioned early and deliberately, so that if disaster strikes later in the loading process, at least the things that genuinely cannot be replaced have already been secured. Word travels through camp early, usually before you have even finished your second bowl of kumis, that the grass in this particular spot has thinned, or the herds have grazed the nearby pasture down to stubble, or a scout has returned describing better ground half a day's ride away, and just like that, the decision is made. Today, apparently, is a moving day, and unlike your own experience of moving house, there is no month of advance notice. No cardboard boxes accumulated gradually in a spare room. There is simply now and an entire household's worth of structure that needs to come down, get packed and go somewhere else, ideally before the sun gets too high and the animals get too restless. You start with the easy part, at least relatively speaking, clearing the interior, rolling up sleeping mats, packing cookware into leather bags, gathering the hanging kumi sack without spilling a drop of the ongoing fermentation project inside it. because losing an entire day's batch to a careless stumble is the kind of mistake that gets brought up at every family gathering for the next several years. Everything has a designated place in this process, a rhythm worked out across countless previous moves, and even the youngest children know exactly which bundle is theirs to carry, because idle hands during a strike are simply not tolerated when there is daylight to lose. Then comes the actual dismantling, and this is where the felt panels, the same ones your family spent days trampling into existence, get unlashed from the willow frame and rolled into tight manageable bundles, while the frame itself, that lattice of bent poles that seemed so permanent an hour ago, collapses down accordion style into a compact stack that one person can carry without much strain. It is genuinely astonishing how quickly a structure that took days to build the fabric for can be reduced, in under an hour, to a pile of poles, felt rolls and rope, ready to be strapped onto the back of a cart or a particularly patient camel if your particular tribe happens to keep a few for exactly this purpose. Everyone has a job, and everyone knows it without being told, the kind of practiced choreography that only comes from doing something hundreds of times before you were even old enough to understand why. An elder oversees the loading of the cart, making sure weight is distributed evenly so nothing tips during travel. Someone else rounds up loose livestock who have, predictably, chosen this exact moment to wander toward the least convenient possible patch of grass. Children ferry smaller items back and forth, feeling important and useful in a way that modern children rarely get to feel while their own parents pack a moving truck, mostly because modern moving trucks do not typically require a 6-year-old's structural contribution. Within the span of a couple of hours, a spot that held an entire functioning household, hearth smoke rising, animals grazing, people going about their morning routines, has been reduced to nothing but flattened grass, the dark circle of ash where the fire used to be, and the fading sound of your own caravan moving off toward the horizon. There is something almost eerie about how completely a home can vanish. No foundation left behind, no structure marking that anyone was ever here at all, just an empty patch of steppe that will, within a season, look exactly like it did before you arrived, as though your entire life here left no more permanent trace than a passing cloud's shadow. Compare this to your own relationship with moving, the dread of packing tape and rented trucks, the weeks of preparation, the lingering exhaustion that follows even a short distance move. Here an entire household, structure and all, can be broken down, transported and reassembled again by evening, a skill so deeply practiced that speed itself becomes a point of quiet competitive pride between families, whispered comparisons about whose household managed the fastest strike this season. There is no lease to break, no forwarding address to file, no utility company to call. There is only the cart, the horses, and the next patch of grass, waiting exactly where the scouts said it would be, assuming, of course, that the scouts were right, which, this being the step, is never entirely guaranteed. Now it's time to actually go somewhere, and going somewhere out here does not mean a short drive. It means an entire tribe, animals and all, moving across open country together, in a slow dust-raising column that stretches further than you can comfortably see from front to back. River crossings represent one of the single most dangerous, tension-filled moments of any migration, since a river that looks manageable from the bank can carry a current strong enough to sweep away a poorly secured cart or a young animal separated from the herd. And the entire tribe approaches each crossing with a level of coordinated caution that stands in sharp contrast to the otherwise steady, workmanlike pace of ordinary travel. Goods get lashed down tighter, weaker swimmers among the livestock get guided carefully by riders positioned on either side, and children are watched with a hawk-like intensity that briefly overrides even the usual demands of herding, because losing a cart of felt and cooking gear is a genuine setback. But losing a person to a fast-moving current is the kind of loss an entire tribe carries for years afterward. Weather can turn a routine day of travel into something considerably more dangerous with very little warning. A clear morning giving way to a sudden violent storm that forces the entire column to halt and shelter as best it can. Carts angled to block the worst of the wind. People and animals huddled together in whatever partial cover the landscape happens to offer. These forced pauses are treated with grim, practiced patience rather than panic, everyone understanding that the steppes' moods are simply part of the deal, and that arguing with weather has never once, in the entire history of your people, actually changed its mind. Songs sung during the long hours of travel help mark both time and distance. Familiar verses passed rider to rider along the length of the column, a low, rolling accompaniment to hoofbeats that makes an otherwise exhausting stretch of open ground feel, if only slightly, more bearable. The migration route, repeated often enough over the years, develops its own informal landmarks, known only to your specific extended family and their closest allies. A particular oddly shaped rock, a bend in a dry riverbed's small private waypoints that mean nothing to an outsider, and everything to anyone who has walked this exact stretch of ground a dozen times before. You fall into your place in this procession without much ceremony, walking or riding alongside carts loaded with felt, cooking gear, and the disassembled bones of your house, while herds of sheep, goats, and horses spread out around the main line of travel, kept loosely in order by riders who circle back and forth, correcting stragglers with a whistle, a shout, or the occasional well-aimed clod of dirt. The pace is set not by ambition, but by the slowest, most vulnerable member of the group, whether that is an elderly relative, a very young child, or a herd of sheep who have collectively decided that this particular tuft of grass is worth stopping for. Negotiations be damned. The sound of migration settles into a strange, hypnotic rhythm after the first hour or so, the creak of cart wheels over uneven ground, the constant low murmur of hooves against dry earth, the occasional bleat or whinny rising up and fading back into the general hum, punctuated by shouted instructions from riders working the edges of the herd. Dust rises in a fine, persistent haze around the entire column, coating your throat, your eyelashes, the inside of your nose, until everyone travelling together shares the exact same dull, gritty film. A communal, involuntary exfoliation nobody signed up for, but everybody experiences equally. There is no map in the way you might picture one, no printed chart with roads and distances marked. Navigation instead relies on an intricate, inherited knowledge of landmarks, the particular shape of a distant hill, the position of the sun and stars, the memory of where good grazing was found in previous years, passed down through generations of elders who function as something between a living GPS and a walking almanac. Scouts range ahead on faster horses, checking water sources, watching for signs of other tribes who might have already claimed the destination you were counting on, because good grazing land does not come with a deed, only with whoever gets there first and is prepared to hold it. Meals during migration are grabbed on the move, dried meat and curds eaten from the saddle, kumis passed around during brief rest stops, nothing that requires stopping the entire column for longer than absolutely necessary, because momentum, once lost, is expensive to regain, especially with weather that can shift from merely uncomfortable to genuinely dangerous with very little warning. You learn to eat while riding, to nap in short, alert bursts, to relieve yourself with a speed and discretion that would honestly impress anyone who has ever complained about a long line for a single gas station bathroom during a modern road trip. Distances covered vary wildly depending on terrain, weather, and the specific needs of the herd, but a tribe might move dozens of miles over the course of several days, following a seasonal pattern that takes them to higher pastures in summer and more sheltered lowland valleys in winter, an annual circuit that has likely been walked, in some form, by this same lineage of families for longer than anyone currently alive can actually trace. It is not wandering, whatever outsiders might assume when they see a column of tents and livestock crossing open country. It is one of the most sophisticated resource management systems the ancient world ever produced, timed with an intimacy toward the land that most modern people, staring at the same four walls of an office every day, would find almost impossible to imagine, let alone execute. Rival tribes complicate matters considerably, since good grazing land is a finite resource and multiple groups often have their eye on the same river valley or pasture, which means part of the calculation behind any migration involves not just where the grass is best, but who else might already be standing on it, armed, mounted, and equally unwilling to simply pack up and leave. Scouts watch for smoke on the horizon as carefully as they watch for storm clouds, because both, in their own way, can ruin your entire week. By the time the column finally slows and the order comes to make camp again, you are exhausted in a way that has nothing to do with effort, and everything to do with the sheer sustained attention migration demands. Hours of vigilance toward animals, weather, terrain, and the general safety of everyone travelling with you. Compare this to your own version of a long road trip, complaining about legroom on an aeroplane or traffic on a highway, and you start to understand that for a steppe nomad, travel itself is not a break from daily life. It is daily life, repeated every few weeks, for an entire lifetime, with the added bonus that your entire house is coming along for the ride, badly packed, slightly damp, and absolutely non-negotiable. It's time for archery practice, and no, you do not get to do this standing still, because standing still on the steppe is a luxury reserved for targets, not warriors. The quiver you carry is not a simple separate tube for arrows, but part of a combined case known to later archaeologists as a garaitos. A single leather unit slung at your hip that holds both the unstrung bow and its arrows together, decorated on wealthier or more prestigious examples with intricate worked gold or bronze plating, depicting the same dynamic animal combat scenes found throughout your tribe's other artwork. Drawing the bowstring itself uses a technique built around a thumb ring rather than the fingers. The thumb hooked around the string and braced by the forefinger, a method that allows for a faster, cleaner release and considerably heavier draw weights than a simple two-finger pull could manage. A small piece of specialised equipment that takes almost as long to master as the shooting itself. Hunting supplements your diet and sharpens the exact same skills demanded by warfare, and a successful mounted hunt for deer, antelope or wild game brings genuine celebration back to camp. Fresh meat that breaks up the routine of dried curds and tough familiar mutton. Young riders are often given their first real taste of mounted shooting under pressure during a hunt rather than a formal practice session, since a fleeing animal provides a far more honest test of nerve and timing than a stationary target ever could, and the first successful kill of a young hunter's life tends to be remembered and retold for years afterward. A young archer's very first solid hit on a moving target earns a small, understated nod from whichever elder happened to be watching. Praise delivered with such restraint that you might almost miss it entirely if you are not already listening carefully for exactly this kind of quiet approval. A bow inherited from a parent or grandparent carries its own quiet weight beyond simple function, and a young archer handed a relative's well-worn bow understands without needing to be told directly that expectations attached to that particular weapon run somewhat higher than they would for an ordinary, freshly made one. The bow you were handed this morning is a compact, double-curved recurve, considerably shorter than the tall bows used by archers in wooded regions to the west, and this is not an accident of poor craftsmanship. It is precision engineering for a very specific purpose, a bow short enough to be drawn and fired comfortably from horseback, constructed from a careful lamination of wood, horn and sinew glued together under tension, a process that can take a bow ear the better part of a year to complete properly, curing slowly through every seasonal change in humidity before it is trusted anywhere near an actual battlefield or hunt. You mount your horse, nock an arrow, and immediately discover that everything you thought you understood about shooting an arrow accurately becomes dramatically more complicated the moment the platform beneath you starts moving independently, breathing, shifting its weight, occasionally spooking at a rustling bush with absolutely no regard for your concentration. Steppe warriors train for years to fire accurately at a full gallop, timing the release of the arrow to the specific moment in the horse's stride, when all 4 hooves are briefly off the ground and the motion beneath the rider smooths out into something almost stable. Technical detail modern sports shooters would need considerable coaching to even understand, let alone execute while also not falling off. Your cousin, standing a respectful but not nearly respectful enough distance away holding a wicker practice target, offers you a look that suggests he remembers exactly how your aim performed last week, and you cannot entirely blame his scepticism. Early attempts at mounted archery tend to go wide, low, occasionally alarmingly close to people who were absolutely not supposed to be anywhere near the intended flight path, and the instructors overseeing your practice, usually older warriors with the scars and the patience to prove it, have developed an entire vocabulary of dry, unimpressed commentary specifically for correcting your form without dignifying your effort with actual praise just yet. The famous Parthian shot, firing backward over your shoulder at full gallop while retreating from an enemy, will not be attempted by you for a considerable while longer, but it is being demonstrated this morning by a rider considerably more experienced than you, twisting at the waist mid-gallop and loosing an arrow behind him with a fluid economy of motion that looks less like combat training and more like the culmination of a lifetime spent treating a bow as a natural extension of the arm holding it. You watch, deeply humbled, while your own most recent arrow embeds itself somewhere in the general vicinity of a target it was not actually aimed at. Strength training happens constantly, if informally, since drawing a composite recurve bow repeatedly requires a specific punishing combination of back, shoulder and core strength that develops gradually over years of daily practice, starting with lighter children's bows and working up as your body matures into something capable of handling a full war bow's draw weight. There is no gym, no resistance machine calibrated to your specific fitness level. There is only more shooting, day after day, until your body simply adapts or you accept a lesser role within the tribe, because on the steppe, the difference between a skilled archer and an unskilled one is frequently the difference between your community surviving a raid and not. Arrows themselves are a study in resourcefulness, fletched with feathers from local birds, tipped with bronze or, increasingly in your era, iron points hammered out by whichever member of the tribe has developed a reputation for metalwork, each one carefully made and, unlike a modern hunter's disposable ammunition, genuinely valuable enough to be retrieved after every practice session. Because losing arrows carelessly is the kind of mistake that gets noticed by people who remember exactly how much labour went into each one. By the time practice wraps up for the morning, your shoulders ache with an unfamiliar deep fatigue, your fingers are raw from the bowstring, and you have, against considerable odds, managed to hit the actual target more times than you missed it entirely. A modest personal victory that nobody around you treats as particularly remarkable, because out here, competent archery is simply the baseline expectation, not an achievement worth celebrating. Compare this to your own experience of physical education. Gentle laps around a gymnasium, maybe a half-hearted unit on archery, using a fixed target, and absolutely no expectation that your life will ever depend on the outcome. Here, missing is not embarrassing. It is simply Tuesday's reminder that the steppe does not grade on a curve, and neither do the neighbours. Let's talk about lunch, and let's be honest with ourselves before we even begin. It is going to be meat, and it is going to be a lot of it, and there is not a single leafy green anywhere in sight. Scurvy and other deficiencies tied to a shortage of fresh produce are a genuine background risk of this diet, particularly by the tail end of a long winter when even the dried curds are running thin, and the fermentation processes behind kumis and certain cheeses turn out, by pure practical accident rather than any understood science, to provide just enough vitamin content to keep the worst of these deficiencies at bay for most of your community, most of the time. Wild garlic, onion and other foraged plants get gathered eagerly whenever the season allows, treated less as a garnish and more as a genuinely valuable nutritional supplement, and a particularly good patch of wild onions discovered along a migration route counts, in its own modest way, as one of the more exciting finds of an otherwise fairly predictable travel day. Fat, whether from horse, sheep or the marrow carefully extracted from cracked bones, is treasured as a dense, portable source of calories particularly valuable during the leaner stretches of a hard migration or a difficult winter, rendered down and stored where possible, mixed into other foods to stretch a thin meal into something more genuinely sustaining. Nothing about this diet is designed around pleasure in the way a modern meal might be, but there is, even so, a kind of hard-won satisfaction in a good, full meal after a demanding day. The same simple, animal contentment that predates cuisine entirely and will presumably outlast it too. Bone marrow, cracked carefully from a cooked joint, counts as something close to a delicacy despite requiring real effort to extract. A small, rich reward for anyone patient enough to work a splintered bone with a knife rather than simply discarding it after the surrounding meat has already been eaten. A meal shared with visiting relatives from a neighbouring camp becomes an opportunity to compare notes on herd health, recent weather, and any concerning news about rival tribes spotted along the horizon, practical information exchanged as casually as modern neighbours might exchange gossip over a shared fence. Your diet out here runs almost entirely on animal products, meat, milk, and the various fermented derivatives of both, supplemented occasionally by whatever wild plants, roots, or berries someone happens to gather along the migration route, and traded grain when circumstances and neighbouring farmers align in your favour. There is no concept of a balanced plate divided neatly into food groups, no colourful chart on a wall reminding you to eat your vegetables, because out here the entire nutritional philosophy can be summarised in a single sentence: eat what keeps you alive. And be grateful there is enough of it. Mutton and horse meat form the backbone of most meals, prepared simply, boiled in a shared pot over the hearth fire or roasted directly over open flame, seasoned with little beyond salt when salt happens to be available. Because elaborate spice cabinets are not exactly a feature of nomadic pantries. The meat itself tends toward tough and stringy rather than tender, since these animals have spent their entire lives working hard on lean forage rather than lounging in a feedlot, and eating it requires the kind of sustained jaw effort that would put a modern dentist on edge, gnawing determinedly at gristle and sinew until it finally, grudgingly, yields blood, somewhat famously, does not go to waste either. Herders occasionally draw a modest, carefully managed amount of blood from a living horse, particularly during lean stretches of migration when other food sources run thin. Mixing it with milk or cooking it into a thick, nutrient-dense sustenance that horrifies modern sensibilities and yet represents a genuinely clever bit of survival math, extracting calories and protein from an animal without having to slaughter it outright. The horse, understandably, is not thrilled about this particular arrangement, but it survives the procedure just fine, which is more than can be said for your appetite the first time someone explains what exactly is in the stew. Organ meats get eaten readily, and without the squeamishness a modern grocery shopper might bring to the concept: liver, kidney, heart. All considered perfectly reasonable parts of the animal, rather than the discarded scraps they have become in much of the modern world. Because when you have gone to the considerable trouble of slaughtering an animal, wasting even a portion of it feels less like a dietary choice and more like a small, unforgivable insult to the effort involved. Nothing gets thrown away. Bones get boiled down for broth and marrow, hides get tanned for clothing and tents, sinew gets stripped for bowstrings and thread, and the animal, in death, continues contributing to your survival in ways a modern shopper picking a shrink-wrapped cut off a supermarket shelf rarely has cause to consider. Milk products round out the diet considerably, not just the kumis you have already grown accustomed to, but but various cheeses and dried curds that can be stored and carried during migration, providing a durable, portable source of protein and fat that does not spoil the way fresh meat inevitably does under a hot summer sun. These dried products get soaked in water or tea when eaten, softening back into something chewable, a rehydration process not entirely unlike the modern habit of reconstituting freeze-dried camping meals, except this particular technology has been in continuous use for well over 1,000 years by the time anyone thinks to put it in a foil pouch. Plant foods enter the picture more rarely. Wild onions, certain roots, occasional berries gathered along the migration route by children sent out specifically for the purpose, treated less as a dietary staple and more as a welcome, flavourful bonus on the days they happen to be available. Some evidence suggests certain steppe groups cultivated small amounts of millet where conditions allowed, a modest concession to agriculture squeezed in around an otherwise thoroughly pastoral lifestyle, though this remains a minor supplement rather than any kind of reliable foundation. Fasting, unplanned and unwelcome, is simply a fact of life during difficult stretches, a hard winter that thins the herds, a drought that dries up grazing land faster than expected, a raid that costs the tribe livestock it desperately needed. There is no reserve of canned goods to fall back on, no grocery store stocked regardless of season, only whatever the herds and the land currently provide, which means hunger, real and recurring, is a companion your entire community learns to live alongside rather than a rare emergency to be solved with a delivery order. Consider, for a moment, your own relationship with food, an entire supermarket of choices available regardless of season, meals delivered to your door within the hour, an abundance so complete that your primary dietary concern is usually eating too much rather than too little. Out here, the question every single day is not what do I feel like eating, but what is actually available. And the answer, more often than not, is meat, milk, and whatever fermented byproduct of the two has been quietly working itself into something edible while you were busy with everything else. It is not a diet built for pleasure, it is a diet built for survival, and by that measure, against a landscape that offers precious little else, it works remarkably well. Gristle, blood, and all. Let's talk about the outside world, because contrary to how isolated the open steppe might feel, your tribe is not nearly as cut off from civilization as the endless grass on the horizon might suggest. Some of the finest evidence of just how far this trade network genuinely reached comes from an extraordinary discovery that will not happen until long after your own lifetime. Deep within one of the frozen Altai kurgans, where archaeologists eventually recover the oldest known pile carpet in the world, a densely knotted wool textile of Persian manufacture, intricately patterned and remarkably well preserved by the same natural deep freeze that protects the tattooed bodies buried nearby. Its presence so far from Persia itself, buried alongside a steppe chieftain rather than a Persian noble, stands as a quiet, physical monument to exactly the kind of long-distance exchange happening in your own camp this very afternoon. Proof that the goods changing hands over a shared meal with a foreign trader might well end up, centuries later, astonishing archaeologists who assumed the ancient steppe was simply too remote for luxury, goods of this quality to have ever reached it. Interpreters play a quiet but essential role in these trading encounters, since your tribe's own language and the Greek or Persian traders' tongues share little common ground, and a skilled go-between, often someone who has spent time in both worlds through captivity, marriage, or simple long exposure to the trade routes, becomes genuinely valuable to both sides, trusted with negotiations that could otherwise collapse entirely over a single badly translated word. You watch these exchanges with real interest, aware that the entire transaction depends on a chain of understanding stretching through at least one, sometimes two, translators standing between you and the foreign trader smiling politely across the fire. A trader who deals fairly one season is remembered and welcomed warmly the next, while one who tries to shortchange your tribe on weight or quality finds the reception considerably cooler on his return, since reputation among these travelling merchants spreads along the same routes their carts actually travel. Trade negotiations occasionally stall entirely over a single disputed item, and resolving the impasse sometimes falls to a respected elder from either side stepping in as an informal mediator, someone whose judgment both parties trust enough to accept without further argument, a role not unlike a modern arbitrator, minus the paperwork and the billable hours. Traders arrive periodically, sometimes overland caravans from Persian territory to the south, sometimes representatives of Greek colonies clustered along the northern shores of the Black Sea, men who have travelled considerable distances specifically because your tribe controls something they want and possesses very little interest in most of what they could otherwise buy at home. Grain, wine, fine metalwork and work textiles arrive in exchange for what your people have in genuine abundance: livestock, hides, furs and slaves, captured in the frequent skirmishes between rival tribes, a grim but economically significant export that fuels a surprising amount of contact between the steppe and the wider Mediterranean world. The negotiation itself unfolds with a formality that might surprise anyone who assumes nomadic life operates without diplomatic nuance. There are customary gestures of hospitality to observe, food and drink offered before any actual business discussion begins, a ritual of trust building that both sides understand and respect, even when neither party particularly likes the other. Because a bad trade this season means a worse winter next season, and everyone involved understands the stakes well enough to keep personal feelings mostly out of the negotiation. You watch, fascinated despite yourself, as a Greek merchant unpacks goods that seem almost absurdly ornate against the practical, weather-beaten backdrop of your camp: delicate painted pottery, fine woven cloth dyed in colours your own felted wool has never managed to achieve, small bronze mirrors polished to a shine that briefly, vainly, tempts even the most stoic steppe warrior into checking his own reflection. These items rarely serve any practical purpose out here, too fragile for a life spent constantly on the move, but they carry status. And status, it turns out, matters just as much to a nomadic warrior as it does to anyone haggling over a name-brand handbag in a modern shopping mall, an uncomfortable bit of universal human nature stretching across 2,500 years without much modification. Wine holds particular appeal, imported in large amphorae that survive the journey remarkably well, and it becomes, among wealthier or more prominent members of the tribe, something of a prestige good, sipped or, according to several unimpressed Greek observers, occasionally drunk undiluted in a manner the wine-growing world considered borderline barbaric, since Greek custom insisted on cutting wine generously with water. Herodotus himself notes, with the faint condescension of a man from a wine-producing culture looking down his nose at anyone who drinks it differently, that certain steppe customs around strong drink struck outsiders as excessive, a detail that has aged rather poorly given how casually modern people now drink liquor served neat. Metalwork represents perhaps the most consequential item of exchange, since your own tribe possesses skilled smiths capable of extraordinary bronze and gold work, much of it depicting animals locked in dramatic combat, stags, griffins and predators, rendered with a stylized intensity that later scholars will label the animal style and study with genuine reverence in museums that do not yet exist. Greek and Persian traders recognize the value of this craftsmanship instantly, and steppe goldwork flows outward through trade networks in exchange for goods flowing in, a two-way current of culture and commerce happening in the middle of what outsiders like to imagine as an empty, trackless wilderness. Herodotus, the Greek historian whose curiosity will one day make your entire way of life famous to people living thousands of years in the future, gathers much of his information about the steppe precisely through contact points like this one, second-hand accounts filtered through merchants, travellers, and the Greek colonial cities along the Black Sea coast that maintain regular, ongoing relationships with steppe tribes. He is not making his observations up from nothing, however strange some of his claims might sound to modern ears. He is compiling them, sometimes accurately, and sometimes with the understandable distortions of a man working from translated second-hand testimony about a culture he has never fully lived inside. There is a wary mutual respect in these exchanges that outsiders rarely expect. Greek writers describe steppe peoples with a mixture of fascination and unease, impressed by their mounted skill and toughness, faintly horrified by customs that diverge sharply from Mediterranean norms, while your own tribe regards these visiting traders with a similarly complicated blend of practical interest and open skepticism about people who apparently spend their entire lives living in one place and calling it civilization. By the time the traders pack up and depart, their carts considerably lighter of trade goods and considerably heavier with hides and captives, your tribe has acquired a modest collection of foreign luxuries that will circulate through the camp for months, admired, occasionally squabbled over, eventually buried alongside someone important enough to take a piece of the wider world with them into the next life. Consider your own experience of online shopping, foreign goods arriving at your door within days, barely registered as remarkable. Out here, a single traded amphora of wine or a single bronze mirror represents weeks of travel, careful negotiation, and genuine cultural exchange between two worlds that otherwise rarely intersect. A reminder that globalization, in its clumsy, dusty, horse-drawn infancy, was already quietly underway. Let's talk about winter, because if summer on the steppe is merely uncomfortable, winter is a genuinely sustained months-long negotiation with your own mortality. Frostbite treatment, such as it is, relies on slow, careful rewarming rather than the more dangerous instinct to plunge a numbed limb directly next to open flame, a lesson usually learned by watching an unlucky relative suffer through the alternative. And older members of the tribe who carry visible reminders of past winters are often the ones most insistent on correcting a younger person's. Technique before real damage sets in. Livestock grow their own thick winter coats naturally, and a horse or sheep in the depths of winter looks almost like an entirely different animal from its sleek summer self, shaggy and rounded. An adaptation your own species can only approximate through many additional layers of felt, wool, and whatever fur you have managed to trade or hunt for. Envying, more than once, the sheer efficiency of an animal that simply grows its own blanket. Snow itself becomes a genuine navigational hazard during the worst winter storms, disorienting even experienced riders within a landscape that offers no trees, no buildings, no fixed points beyond whatever the blowing white manages to obscure. And more than one traveller over the generations has been lost this way, found only once the weather cleared, if they were found at all. Ropes strung between the tent and the nearest livestock pen during the fiercest storms give people a physical line to follow blind through the whiteout. A low-tech but genuinely life-saving precaution that costs nothing but a length of hemp cord and the foresight to string it up before the storm actually arrives. A particularly hard winter becomes, in later years, a fixed reference point for the whole tribe, measured against and compared to every subsequent bad season. The specific year remembered less by a calendar date than by exactly how many animals were lost, and how close things genuinely came to disaster. A particularly severe winter storm sometimes forces several neighbouring households to combine their sheltered ground temporarily, tents pitched closer together than usual, herds mingled for the duration, an emergency cooperation that briefly overrides the ordinary social distance between families and reminds everyone involved just how much their individual survival actually depends on everyone else's. Temperatures on the open steppe plunge to depths that would sound exaggerated if they were not so thoroughly documented, well below freezing for weeks at a stretch, with winds sweeping unobstructed across thousands of miles of flat treeless terrain that offers your camp absolutely no natural shelter beyond whatever low hills or river valleys your elders had the foresight to migrate toward before. the first hard frost arrived. There is no mountain range to block the wind, no forest to slow it down, just an open howling expanse that turns even a short walk between tents into a genuine test of endurance. Your felt tent, so recently a source of pride, becomes the single thin membrane standing between your body heat and a climate actively trying to extinguish it. Extra layers of felt get lashed over the existing walls for winter, and snow, counterintuitively, becomes something of an ally once it piles up against the base of the tent, its own insulating properties trapping additional warmth the same way it does for anyone who has ever built or heard of an igloo. A fact your ancestors discovered through cold. Hard experience rather than any formal study of thermal physics. The hearth fire inside becomes an object of genuine, unrelenting devotion during these months. Tended constantly, fed carefully, never once allowed to fully die, because relighting a fire from scratch in the dead of a steppe winter, with numb fingers and howling wind working against you at every step, is a genuinely dangerous proposition that has cost lives before and will cost more before this winter is finished. Someone is always awake, or at least half awake, monitoring the coals through the night, the household equivalent of a rotating night watch, except the enemy here is not a raiding party, but simple thermodynamics. Livestock management shifts entirely for the cold months. Herds move to sheltered valleys where wind exposure is reduced, and where enough dried grass remains accessible beneath a manageable depth of snow for animals to paw through and graze. A practice that requires careful advance planning during the warmer months, because a herd that starves over winter means a family that starves thee. Following spring, a particularly brutal winter, one with unusually deep snow or an unexpected ice storm that seals grass beneath the crust animals, cannot break through, can wipe out a significant portion of a family's entire wealth in the span of a few catastrophic weeks. An economic disaster considerably more devastating than anything a modern stock market crash could inflict. Since your wealth here breathes, eats, and can simply keel over in the snow. Clothing layers up dramatically. Thick felt boots, wool and leather garments, fur linings where available, traded or hunted specifically for this purpose. And the overall effect transforms every member of your tribe into a somewhat rounder, considerably bulkier version of themselves, moving with the deliberate, padded caution of someone who genuinely cannot afford to slip on ice and break a bone this far from anything resembling medical care. Frostbite is a constant, quietly accepted risk, and older members of the tribe often carry visible reminders on fingers, toes and ears, a permanent record of past winters survived rather than a source of shame. Food stores, carefully rationed dried meat and curds, accumulated through the productive months, get stretched as far as they can possibly go, meals growing smaller and more repetitive as winter drags on, hunger becoming a familiar, unwelcome companion by the time the first genuine thaw finally arrives. Children are taught early to ration their own portions instinctively, an entire generation raised with a relationship to food scarcity that modern audiences, accustomed to refrigerators stocked regardless of season, would find almost impossible to fully internalise, no matter how vividly it gets described to them. Entertainment during the long, dark winter months turns inward, storytelling around the hearth, the recounting of ancestral deeds and clan history, songs passed down through generations, all of it serving the dual purpose of morale and cultural preservation, an oral library maintained purely through repetition, because there is, of course, no written alternative to fall back on. These long winter nights, huddled close for warmth, listening to the same beloved stories, told slightly differently by each storyteller's particular style, represent some of the only unhurried, genuinely restful hours in an otherwise relentlessly demanding yearly cycle. Compare all of this to your own experience of winter. A thermostat nudged upward, a coat purchased online and delivered within days, complaints about a slightly delayed commute standing in for genuine hardship. Out here, winter is not an inconvenience to be managed. It is a recurring, months-long threat that has to be actively fought, planned against, and survived through sheer accumulated skill and stubbornness. And every single spring that your tribe emerges from it, thinner, colder, and profoundly relieved, counts as a genuine, hard-won victory against a continent that spends half the year quietly trying to kill you. Let's talk about summer, because if you were hoping the warmer months might offer some relief from constant environmental hostility, the steppe would like a brief word. Sudden summer dust storms occasionally sweep across the open grassland with startling speed, visibility dropping to almost nothing within minutes, and the correct response drilled into every member of the tribe from childhood is not to panic and scatter, but to gather quickly, cover your face with cloth, and wait it out in place. Since wandering blindly during one of these storms is a far more reliable way to get lost, or worse, than simply enduring a few unpleasant, grit-filled minutes. Ticks join the flies in their own persistent summer campaign against you and your livestock, embedding themselves in places that require patient, careful removal, and checking each other for them becomes another small, unglamorous ritual of the warmer months, performed with the same resigned thoroughness your own era might reserve for reapplying sunscreen. Wild predators, wolves especially, grow bolder during the harsher months when their own usual prey grows scarce, and guarding the herd against them becomes a shared nighttime responsibility. Dogs bred and trained specifically for this purpose, barking the alarm long before human ears could ever detect an approaching threat. Losing an animal to a wolf pack stings in a way that feels almost personal, not just an economic loss, but a small defeat in an ongoing ancient rivalry between your people and a predator who has been testing the edges of your herds for as long as anyone can remember. Shade itself becomes a small, contested resource on the hottest days. The thin strip cast by a cart or a tent wall, claimed quickly by whoever reaches it first, a minor, good-natured territorial squabble that nobody takes too seriously, since everyone knows the sun will simply move again within the hour anyway. A sudden midsummer hailstorm, rare but not unheard of, can shred a season's worth of exposed felt and bruised livestock badly enough to matter, and the scramble to get animals and people under any available cover during one of these brief, violent bursts is treated with the same urgency as a genuine winter storm, despite lasting, more often than not, only a few sharp, unpleasant minutes. The same flat, treeless, wind-scoured landscape that turns winter into a howling ordeal transforms, come summer, into an open oven with absolutely no shade to be found for miles in any direction, temperatures climbing well into territory that would earn a heat advisory from any modern weather service, all while you continue performing the exact same physically demanding daily routine, herding, riding, milking and moving camp, because the steppe does not particularly care whether the temperature suits your preferences. Your skin, already weathered by wind and smoke, bears the brunt of relentless direct sun, with none of the modern conveniences you might reach for without a second thought. No sunscreen, no sunglasses, no wide-brimmed sun hat purchased specifically for the occasion. Squinting becomes a semi-permanent facial expression, deep creases forming early around the eyes of everyone who spends their life exposed to this particular quality of light, a natural, unavoidable version of the crow's feet a modern person might spend considerable money trying to erase. Water management becomes the single most important logistical concern of the entire season. Since summer heat accelerates the evaporation of the seasonal streams and shallow pools your tribe depends on, and a migration route that seemed perfectly reasonable in spring can turn into a genuine gamble by midsummer if a particular water source has dried up earlier than expected. Scouts range ahead specifically checking water levels, and an entire tribe's summer movements are dictated as much by where reliable water can be found as by where the grazing happens to be good, since livestock and people alike cannot survive more than a few days without it under this kind of relentless heat. Insects arrive in their own overwhelming summer abundance, clouds of biting flies that torment both livestock and people throughout the daylight hours, driving herds into a restless, tail-swishing misery that makes them considerably harder to manage, and drives you, more than once, to genuine, weary hatred of a creature that weighs approximately nothing and yet somehow ruins your entire afternoon. Horses in particular suffer, and part of your job during summer involves helping keep insects off the animals through smoke, mud, or simply relentless swatting. An ongoing battle that nobody involved is ever fully winning. The felt tent that kept you alive through winter becomes, in summer, something closer to an oven itself, and adjustments get made accordingly. Wall panels rolled up partway to let air circulate, the smoke hole opened wide, sometimes the whole family sleeping outside entirely on especially stifling nights, spread out on mats under open sky rather than trapped inside insulation that was never designed with summer comfort in mind. There is a particular irony in owning a house specifically engineered to trap heat, and then spending half the year trying to convince it to release some of that same heat back out. Sunstroke and dehydration pose genuine, recurring dangers, particularly for children and the elderly, when there is no air-conditioned refuge to retreat into, no cold drink from a refrigerator, only whatever shade a tent flap or a patiently positioned cart might offer. And the discipline of drinking enough fermented mare's milk or water throughout a long day of riding to avoid collapsing entirely, a discipline your body learns quickly, because the alternative lesson tends to be considerably more memorable and considerably less pleasant. And yet summer is not without its genuine compensations, because this is also the season of relative abundance, grass growing thick and green, herds fattening visibly, milk flowing freely enough that surplus can be processed into the dried curds that will carry the tribe through the lean winter months ahead. There is an urgency to summer that everyone understands instinctively, a narrow window in which the entire year's food security has to be secured, and the long, brutal daylight hours get used accordingly, work stretching from the earliest grey light until well past what a modern office worker would consider a reasonable end to the day. Consider your own summer. Complaints about a hot commute solved instantly by air-conditioned transit. A cold drink always within reach. Sunscreen applied as an afterthought rather than a survival necessity. Out here, summer offers you longer days, warmer nights, and marginally less risk of freezing to death, and in exchange demands sunburn, dehydration, biting insects, and the same relentless workload as every other season, adjusted only for the specific new ways the climate has found to make your life difficult. The steppe, it turns out, does not really do easy seasons. It only offers you a rotating menu of different specific hardships, and summer's particular specialty is simply making sure you never forget exactly how large and exposed the horizon really is. Let's talk about the people out there beyond your own camp, because the open steppe you call home is shared uneasily with other tribes, and not all of them consider your herds, your horses, or your territory entirely off limits. The short iron sword carried at your hip, later archaeologists will eventually label an akanekes, is a compact, double-edged weapon designed for close, brutal work rather than the long reach of a spear, ideal for the chaotic, fast-moving skirmishes that define steppe combat far more often than any pitched formal battle. Armour, where it exists at all, tends toward flexible protection rather than heavy plating, small bronze or iron scales sewn onto a leather or felt backing that allows a rider full freedom of movement, a practical compromise between protection and mobility that prioritises your ability to stay mounted and keep firing arrows over any hope of shrugging off a direct hit, since on the steppe, staying mobile is very often the actual difference between surviving an engagement and not. Raiding parties typically strike at dawn or under cover of darkness, timing chosen deliberately to catch a rival camp still groggy and disorganised, and the entire defensive posture of your own tribe, the posted watches, the weapons kept close, the general wariness toward unfamiliar riders, exists specifically to blunt exactly this kind of surprise. A successful defence earns real, lasting respect within the tribe, retold at gatherings for years afterward, while a camp caught unprepared suffers a blow to both its herds and its reputation that can take considerably longer to recover from than the material losses alone would suggest. A warrior who returns from a skirmish having lost equipment rather than his life is teased about the loss for weeks, since replacing a bow or a good knife takes real time and effort, and out here even good-natured mockery serves a practical purpose, reminding everyone present to hold onto their gear a little tighter next time. A scar earned defending the herd rather than in open combat still counts for something within the tribe's informal ledger of respect, since driving off a determined predator or a lone opportunistic raider takes real nerve regardless of whether the story ever gets told, with quite the same drama as natural battle. Warfare here does not look like the organised, formation-based battles you might associate with Greek hoplites or Persian infantry. It looks like raiding, fast, mobile and opportunistic small mounted parties striking at rival encampments, driving off livestock and vanishing back across open country before any organised response can be mounted. A style of conflict built entirely around the same mounted archery skills you have spent your own childhood painfully acquiring. Every adult member of your tribe, male and female alike, is expected to be capable of defending the camp on short notice, because there is no professional standing army out here separating warriors from everyone else. Everyone is, to some functional degree, a warrior, whether they particularly wanted the job or not. You learn to sleep lightly, a habit so deeply ingrained that it barely registers as unusual. Ears are tuned even in rest to the specific sound of hoofbeats approaching at an unfamiliar pace, or the distant bark of a dog whose alarm carries a different urgency than its usual evening complaints. Watches get posted at night on a rotating basis, and the responsibility is taken seriously. Because a successful raid can cost a tribe a meaningful percentage of its entire wealth in a single chaotic hour, animals scattered, some killed outright, others driven off into the darkness by riders who know the terrain just as well as you do. Weapons stay close at hand, always, a bow and quiver never far from where you sleep. A short sword or dagger worn at the hip even during routine daily chores. An unspoken but universally understood readiness that colours nearly every interaction with strangers or unfamiliar riders spotted on the horizon. Trust is not extended casually out here, and the careful formal hospitality rituals observed with visiting traders exist precisely because the alternative, an unannounced approach with unclear intentions, is treated with immediate armed suspicion rather than polite curiosity. Status within the tribe is closely tied to warrior accomplishment, and killing an enemy in combat carries real, tangible social significance, recorded and displayed in ways that would strike a modern observer as remarkably direct. Herodotus himself describes steppe warriors drinking the blood of the first enemy they kill in battle, and presenting the heads of slain foes to their chieftain as proof of their contribution. Gruesome practices by modern standards, certainly, but ones that functioned within their own society as a clear, unambiguous system of earned respect, not entirely unlike a modern workplace's obsession with visible metrics, except considerably higher stakes and considerably less paperwork involved in the performance review. Scalping, another practice Herodotus records with evident fascination, served a similarly practical function, a portable, undeniable trophy proving a warrior's kill count that could be displayed, counted, and used to calculate a share of captured plunder, an accounting system written not in ledgers but in grim physical proof carried on a warrior's own equipment. It is worth remembering, before recoiling too dramatically, that plenty of ancient and even considerably more recent societies developed their own versions of trophy-taking in warfare. The steppes simply left behind an unusually well-documented account of theirs. Alliances between tribes shift constantly, built and broken according to shared threats. Marriage arrangements between prominent families, or simple opportunistic calculation about which neighbouring group currently poses more benefit as a friend than as a target, a fluid, ever-changing political landscape that requires the same kind of constant attention as managing herds or tracking weather patterns. A tribe that seemed friendly last season might, through a change in leadership or a particularly hard winter that leaves them desperate, become a genuine threat this season, and the wise family keeps its guard up regardless of recent history. Children absorb this reality early, mock combat and competitive games doubling as genuine training, wrestling matches, races and archery contests that build both the physical skill and the psychological readiness that actual warfare demands, delivered with far less ceremony than a modern parent enrolling their child in a self-defense class, mostly because out here, the stakes of skipping this particular education are considerably higher than a bruised ego. Consider for a moment your own relationship with personal safety, locked doors, security systems, a general assumption that violent conflict is something that happens to other people, in other places, reported on the news rather than lived directly. Out here, the possibility of raid or conflict is a persistent background hum in daily life, never quite absent, never quite dominant either, simply another factor woven into every decision about where to camp, how to post a watch, and who gets trusted with a weapon at what age. It is a harder way to live, certainly, but it produced across the wider steppe some of the most feared mounted warriors the ancient world ever encountered, a reputation earned the hard way, one tense, sleepless night watch at a time. Let's talk about your skin, because out here it is doing considerably more work than simply covering your body. It is also, quite literally, telling your life story to anyone who knows how to read it. Long after your own lifetime, archaeologists working in the same high Altai region will pull an extraordinarily well-preserved young woman from a frozen kurgan, her body wrapped in fine textiles, her skin marked with the same elaborate animal-style tattoos covering her shoulders and arms, a discovery the modern world comes to know as the Ice Maiden, or the Princess of Ukok. And her presence, buried with considerable ceremony in her own sacrificed horses, becomes one of the clearest pieces of physical proof that women in your society held real substantial status of their own, tattooed, honoured, and mourned with every bit of the elaborate ritual otherwise reserved for prominent men. You will never know her, obviously, separated as you are by both distance and time, but the ink she carries and the ink you are considering for your own skin belong to the exact same visual language, one that will, remarkably, still be legible to strangers examining her frozen arm more than 2,000 years from now. Tattoo pigment itself is prepared from soot or crushed plant matter, mixed with a binding liquid, applied beneath the skin through repeated careful puncturing rather than any single continuous line. A slow, painstaking process that leaves the finished design looking almost embossed once healed. A subtle relief you can feel as well as see when you run a finger across an old, well-settled tattoo. Certain motifs carry specific, widely understood meanings across the steppe. A particular predator associated with ferocity in battle, a stag associated with speed and status, so that even a stranger from a distant allied tribe can read the broad strokes of your accomplishments at a glance. A shared visual vocabulary stretching across considerable cultural and geographic distance. A design added to your skin during a particularly significant year of your life becomes, over time, a kind of permanent calendar entry, and older relatives can often recount, with real precision, exactly which tattoo corresponds to which distant, memorable event decades after the fact. A particularly striking tattoo design sometimes gets copied, with the original wearer's blessing, by a younger relative eager to honour both the pattern and the accomplishment it represents. A small act of imitation that carries real meaning rather than being seen as unoriginal or derivative. Tattooing runs deep in steppe culture. Applied with sharpened bone or bronze needles, and a dark pigment worked into the skin in intricate flowing patterns depicting animals locked in combat. stags with elaborately branching antlers, snarling predators, mythical composite creatures blending features of several beasts at once. The same dynamic animal style that shows up in your tribe's metalwork in felt applique, except now rendered permanently across arms, shoulders and torsos rather than hammered into gold. This is not a casual decision made on a whim during a particularly eventful evening. It is a considered, painful and socially significant process, undertaken deliberately and added to gradually over the course of a lifetime. You watch the process happen to an older relative one evening by firelight. Someone experienced holding the skin taut while another works the pigment in with slow, careful patience. The whole procedure taking hours and clearly hurting considerably, though the recipient bears it with the same stoic, faintly bored expression stepped warriors seem to cultivate for every form of physical hardship, as though winking openly might somehow count against them later. There is no numbing agent beyond perhaps a generous helping of kumis beforehand, and the resulting design, once healed, becomes a permanent visible record that will still be legible on the body decades later. A detail modern archaeologists confirmed rather spectacularly when they discovered remarkably preserved tattooed skin on bodies frozen for over 2,000 years in the high mountain. Kurgans. The designs are not random decoration chosen for personal taste alone, though aesthetic preference certainly plays some role. They frequently commemorate specific achievements, a successful hunt, a victory in battle, a milestone within the tribe's social hierarchy, functioning as a kind of wearable ursum that announces a person's accomplishments before they have said a single word. A warrior heavily tattooed across both arms and torso is, at a glance, someone who has clearly lived an eventful, accomplished life, while someone with sparse or minimal markings has either had less opportunity to earn them, or, less charitably, has simply not yet proven themselves in the eyes of the tribe. Status matters enormously in how these tattoos get read by others and elaborate. Extensive tattooing correlates closely with high social rank. The frozen remains of a particularly prominent individual excavated from the Pazyryk region in the distant future, revealing an astonishingly dense, sophisticated network of animal designs covering nearly the entire visible body, suggesting someone of considerable importance who had accumulated both the achievements and the social. Standing to display them so thoroughly. It is not unlike a modern military uniform covered in medals and service ribbons, except considerably more permanent and considerably more uncomfortable to acquire. Women receive tattoos as well, though the specific designs and placement sometimes differ from those chosen by men, and this detail matters for correcting a persistent modern assumption that steppe tattooing was an exclusively male warrior tradition. Frozen remains identified as women have been found bearing intricate tattoos every bit as elaborate as those found on men. A quiet but firm piece of physical evidence that women in this society held meaningful status of their own, earned and displayed through the same permanent, painful process, rather than existing purely as background figures in a warrior culture built entirely around men. The process itself becomes something of a communal event when performed on a prominent member of the tribe, others gathering to watch, offer encouragement, share stories of their own tattooing experiences, the whole proceeding taking on a ceremonial weight that elevates it well beyond simple body decoration into something closer to a formal rite of passage. Younger members of the tribe watch these sessions closely, absorbing both the technique and the social significance, understanding early that their own skin will, eventually, become a canvas recording whatever life manages to throw at them. Consider, for a moment, your own relationship with tattoos, a deeply personal choice made in an air-conditioned studio, applied with an electric needle in a fraction of the time, chosen from a design book or a personal sketch, with total individual freedom over meaning and placement. Out here, tattoos exist within a shared visual language the entire tribe understands and reads collectively, less an expression of individual identity and more a public record of communal accomplishment permanently inscribed proof that you have, in fact, lived a life worth remembering. It is body art functioning simultaneously as biography, resume, and social contract, and unlike your own tattoos, there is no removing it later if you change your mind, which out here, nobody ever seems inclined to do anyway. Let's talk about the person in your camp everyone treats with a very particular blend of respect and low-grade nervousness, because every step community includes at least one individual whose job description involves communicating with a world the rest of you cannot see. The drum the shaman relies on is its own carefully constructed object, stretched hide over a wooden frame, sometimes painted with symbols representing specific spirit guides or ancestral figures, and it is treated with a level of respect that borders on the sacred, never handled carelessly by anyone outside the shaman's own practice. Certain plants and substances, burned or otherwise consumed, play a documented role in helping shamans across the wider steppe world reach the particular altered state their spiritual work requires, a practice broadly consistent with shamanic traditions found across much of ancient Eurasia and beyond. And it is worth noting that your community's later use of hemp vapour during funerary. Purification sits within this same broader cultural comfort, with using smoke, rhythm and ritual substance deliberately to shift consciousness for a specific sanctioned spiritual purpose, rather than treating altered states as something to fear or avoid. Herbal knowledge sits close beside the shaman's more overtly spiritual work, in a good portion of what looks, from the outside, like mystical practice is really accumulated, practical botanical expertise, which plants ease a fever, which poultice draws out infection, which root calms an upset stomach, tested and refined over generations, and bundled together with the ritual framework that gives it social authority and weight. You come to the shaman's tent for both kinds of help without drawing much distinction between them, since in your world, a body and a spirit troubled by the same illness are simply not treated as two separate problems requiring two separate specialists. A shaman nearing the end of their own life often spends considerable time identifying and training whoever will eventually take up the role next, passing along not just practical herbal knowledge, but the specific rhythms, songs, and inherited stories that give the position its full spiritual weight within the tribe. A shaman's advice is not always followed without question, and a skeptical elder occasionally pushes back on a particular interpretation of an omen. A reminder that even within a deeply spiritual framework, steppe culture leaves real room for practical disagreement, rather than blind, unquestioning deference. The shaman occupies a genuinely unique position within your tribe, neither quite a religious leader in the way a modern audience might picture one, nor simply a healer, but some combination of both roles fused together with additional responsibilities toward interpreting omens, communicating with ancestral and animal spirits, and guiding the tribe through significant transitions, birth, illness, death, and the great uncertain unknowns that no amount of practical steppe skill can fully resolve on its own. This role is not chosen casually or inherited automatically. It often arrives through a personal crisis, an illness, a vivid and disturbing set of dreams, or an experience the tribe interprets collectively as a genuine spiritual calling that cannot reasonably be ignored. You approach the shaman's tent with a certain instinctive wariness, because unlike the ordinary bustle of the rest of camp, this particular space carries a different atmosphere entirely. Hung with strange objects, animal bones, feathers, small carved figures, bundles of dried plants whose specific purpose you have never quite worked up the courage to ask about directly. The air inside often carries a distinct, heavy scent, herbs burned deliberately to create a particular mood, or, in certain rituals, to help the shaman achieve the altered state of consciousness their work is understood to require. Illness in your community gets addressed through a combination of practical remedies, herbal treatments, wound care learned through hard experience, and the shaman's more mysterious interventions, chanting, rhythmic drumming, the reading of signs in animal bones or entrails, an attempt to diagnose not just the physical symptom, but the deeper spiritual cause believed to underlie it. A modern doctor might raise an eyebrow at treating a fever by consulting the pattern of cracks in a heated shoulder blade, but from within your own worldview, physical and spiritual health are simply not treated as separate categories the way modern medicine tends to insist upon, and the shaman's role bridges both without any sense of contradiction. Drumming forms a central part of many shamanic practices here, a steady hypnotic rhythm that the shaman uses to enter a trance state, understood within your community as a genuine journey, the shaman's spirit travelling to communicate directly with the ancestors, with animal guides, or with the broader unseen forces believed to govern weather, fortune, and fate. You have watched this happen before, the shaman's movements growing increasingly erratic and unself-conscious as the drumming builds, eyes rolling back, voice dropping into unfamiliar registers, the whole performance genuinely unsettling to witness, even for someone who has grown up entirely within this belief system and trusts it completely. Omens get read constantly in the world around you, the flight pattern of birds, the behaviour of livestock before a storm, strange formations in cloud cover, and the shaman serves as the community's primary interpreter of these signs, weighing in on decisions as significant as when to begin migration, or whether a particular campsite carries bad fortune worth avoiding entirely. This is not treated as superstition in the dismissive modern sense of the word. It is treated as genuinely useful, practical information, gathered through a different but equally legitimate method than tracking weather patterns or reading animal tracks. And elders consult the shaman with the same seriousness a modern executive might bring to consulting a trusted, expensive analyst before a major decision. Funerary rites fall heavily under the shaman's responsibility as well, guiding the complex multi-stage process of properly sending the dead into the next world, a role that, as you will discover shortly, involves considerably more than simply digging a hole and saying a few respectful words. The shaman's presence at these rituals is considered essential, someone spiritually qualified to ensure the deceased's journey proceeds correctly, and that the living, grieving and vulnerable in their loss, remain protected from whatever spiritual danger an improperly conducted funeral might invite. The shaman also serves somewhat unexpectedly as a kind of community counsellor, consulted privately about personal troubles, family disputes, romantic difficulties, the ordinary human messiness that every society produces regardless of century or continent, offered guidance that blends practical wisdom accumulated from years of listening to the tribe's problems with genuine spiritual insight the community believes the shaman alone possesses. It is not so different, really, from a modern person seeking out a therapist, a priest, and a particularly wise older relative, all rolled into one exhausted, overworked individual who somehow never gets a proper day off. Consider your own relationship with the unexplainable medical uncertainty resolved through further testing. Anxiety addressed through therapy appointments, scheduled weeks in advance, existential questions largely left unanswered and quietly ignored in the business of daily life. Out here, the shaman represents an entire community's structured, serious attempt to make sense of everything modern medicine, modern psychology, and modern religion have since split into entirely separate professions, all housed within a single smoke-filled tent and a single, remarkably burdened individual who has agreed, for reasons of calling rather than career ambition, to carry that weight for everyone else. Let's talk about death, because out here it is not treated as a quiet private affair concluded quickly and moved past. It is treated as one of the most significant, elaborate, resource-intensive undertakings your entire community will ever collectively perform. The number of horses sacrificed for a truly prominent burial can be genuinely staggering by any standard, and some of the grandest kurgans excavated by archaeologists long after your own era contain the remains of 10, 20, even considerably more horses interred alongside their owner, each one representing not just a spiritual gift for the afterlife, but an enormous, visible display of the deceased's real, accumulated wealth in a society where horses function as the single most important form of currency available. Watching even a modest local version of this sacrifice unfold is sobering. Animals you have known and worked alongside for years led forward as part of the ceremony. A stark reminder that in this world, honouring the dead properly means genuinely sacrificing a meaningful portion of the tribe's living wealth, rather than simply setting aside a token gesture. The burial chamber itself is lined carefully with timber, sometimes with an inner wooden structure resembling a small house built specifically to shelter the deceased, and the entire construction reflects a genuine, considerable investment of skilled labour, carpenters and diggers working for days under the direction of elders who have overseen enough of these constructions to know exactly how the finished mound needs to be shaped to survive centuries of wind and weather. Later visitors passing this same stretch of steppe, generations after your own lifetime, will still be able to see the mound rising from the flat grassland, a permanent, unmistakable marker announcing that someone significant once lived, and died, and was properly thoroughly honoured on exactly this spot. Whether during the burial itself is watched closely and read for meaning, a sudden wind or an unexpected clear sky, both interpreted by the shaman as potentially significant. One more layer of meaning folded into an already elaborate, carefully observed ceremony. A kurgan under construction draws curious visitors from neighbouring camps who have heard news of the death travel ahead of them, arriving to pay respects and, quietly, to observe exactly how elaborate the burial preparations are shaping up to be. Since the scale of a funeral says almost as much about a family's standing as any other single event in the tribe's calendar. Word spreads through camp fast when someone of importance dies, a chieftain, a respected warrior, an elder whose accumulated wisdom the tribe has relied upon for decades, and the response is immediate and dramatic. Herodotus himself, writing about steppe funerary customs with the fascinated detail of an outsider who clearly could not quite believe what he was describing, records that the body of a deceased king or nobleman was first embalmed and then paraded through the territory of every allied tribe in a lengthy procession, each community receiving the body, mourning it formally, and often participating in visible displays of grief that included cutting a portion of an ear, slashing the arms and lacerating the forehead and nose, blood and grief mingling in a display of mourning that leaves absolutely no ambiguity about the community's loss. You witness a smaller version of this intensity when someone from your own camp passes. The entire community pausing its usual routine, the deceased laid out with careful ceremony, while preparations begin for what will become, depending on the person's status. Either a relatively modest local burial, or, for genuinely prominent figures, an extended months-long process involving travel, elaborate preparation of the body, and the eventual construction of a substantial burial mound called a kurgan, a structure requiring enormous coordinated labour from the entire tribe and often several allied groups besides. The kurgan itself is no small undertaking, a deep timber-lined chamber excavated into the earth, sometimes reinforced with additional wooden structures resembling a small house built specifically to shelter the deceased in the afterlife, followed by an enormous mound of earth and stone piled on top, visible for miles across the flat steppe terrain and clearly intended to remain a permanent marker. For generations, you have ridden past older kurgans on the horizon your entire life without fully appreciating, until now, watching one being constructed firsthand, exactly how much collective effort goes into building what is, essentially, a very large, very permanent monument to a single person's life and status. Grave goods accompany the deceased in a quantity that would make a modern estate sale planner faint. Weapons, gold and bronze jewellery, elaborate clothing, ceremonial vessels, food and drink meant to sustain the departed on their journey, and, for particularly high-status burials, sacrificed horses, sometimes dozens at once, buried alongside their owner so that he might continue riding in whatever world comes next. This is not casual excess. It reflects a genuinely held belief that the afterlife requires the same practical resources as this one, and sending someone into it without their horse, their weapons, and a considerable quantity of gold would be considered not generous restraint, but genuine, unforgivable negligence toward the dead. Servants and, in some documented cases, a wife or concubine were sacrificed to accompany particularly powerful figures into the burial mound. A practice that strikes modern sensibilities as genuinely disturbing, and reasonably so, though it reflects a broader ancient world pattern in which status and companionship in death mirrored status and companionship in life with an unsettling literalness. That few societies, ancient or modern, have fully escaped in one form or another. You watch these preparations with the particular numbness that comes from witnessing your culture's normal, unremarkable customs collide, briefly, with just how extraordinary they would look to someone from outside it. The funeral itself unfolds over days rather than hours, feasting, ritual mourning. The shaman's careful guidance ensuring every step proceeds correctly, and a genuine communal outpouring of grief that involves the entire tribe rather than simply immediate family. Because in a society this tightly interdependent, the loss of any significant member genuinely affects everyone's collective well-being, practically as well as emotionally. There is no quiet, private grieving process tucked away from public view. Grief here is loud, physical, and thoroughly communal, expressed through wailing, self-inflicted wounds, and elaborate ceremony rather than restrained, dignified silence. Compare this to your own experience of funerals, a relatively brief service, tasteful flower arrangements, a burial completed within days and largely delegated to professionals you have hired specifically so you do not have to manage the logistics yourself while grieving. Out here, the entire tribe becomes, temporarily, a workforce dedicated entirely to properly honouring the dead, digging, building, mourning, and feasting together for as long as the process demands. An investment of collective time and resources that modern audiences, accustomed to funeral homes and pre-arranged packages, might find almost incomprehensible in scale. It is, in its own dramatic, blood-streaked way, one of the most sincere expressions of communal love and respect the ancient world ever produced, however alarming certain specific details might sound to anyone hearing about it for the first time over a comfortable modern dinner. Now it's time to actually prepare the body itself, because a funeral procession spanning weeks and travelling across the territories of multiple allied tribes requires a corpse that can, quite practically, survive the journey. Some of the frozen remains eventually recovered from these kurgans show something else entirely unexpected, clear evidence of trepanation. A surgical procedure involving the careful removal of a small section of skull, apparently performed while the patient was still alive in at least some documented cases, suggesting a level of practical medical knowledge and steady-handed skill among certain steppe practitioners that modern audiences rarely associate with a nomadic warrior culture. Whether performed to relieve pressure from a head injury, treat a persistent ailment, or address some purpose modern researchers can only speculate about, the healed bone surrounding several of these skull openings proves the patient survived the procedure for some time afterward. A small, startling reminder that the line between grim ritual and genuine surgical competence out here is considerably blurrier and considerably more impressive than a passing glance at the era might suggest. Some burials, rather than a full kurgan, involve a considerably more modest grave for ordinary members of the tribe, still treated with real care and appropriate ritual, but without the enormous mound or the extensive grave goods reserved for chieftains and highly accomplished warriors, a practical acknowledgement that not every death commands the same resources even within a culture deeply committed to honouring its dead. You understand this distinction without resentment, since the scale of a funeral out here reflects a person's life and contribution rather than any promise of equal treatment regardless of status. An honest, if occasionally uncomfortable, reflection of how your entire society actually organises itself. Even a modest grave receives a small marker of some kind, a placed stone or a simple mound, since leaving absolutely no trace of where a person was laid to rest is considered a genuine failure of basic respect, regardless of how much or how little that particular person's life could afford in grander ceremony. Tools used specifically for the embalming process are kept separate from ordinary household items, treated with a wary, careful respect by everyone aware of their particular purpose, stored in their own dedicated bundle rather than mixed in among the everyday knives and implements used for cooking or hide work. Herodotus describes the process in surprising detail for a man writing from considerable geographical and cultural distance, explaining that the body of a deceased king was opened, cleansed and filled with a mixture of crushed cypress, incense, parsley seed and anise, before being carefully sewn back up. A rudimentary but genuinely effective form of embalming, designed specifically to slow decomposition during a funeral procession that could stretch on for 40 days as the body travelled from one allied tribal territory to the next, each community pausing its own routines to receive and mourn the deceased in turn. You watch or hear described in careful, hushed detail by those who have witnessed it, a process that requires real skill and no small amount of nerve. Someone experienced in this particular grim craft working with careful precision, because getting it wrong means a body that will not survive the journey intact, an outcome that would represent a genuine embarrassing failure of respect toward both the deceased and every allied tribe scheduled to receive the procession along its route. This is specialised knowledge, passed down and practised by individuals whose entire reputation within the tribe rests on getting this exact, unpleasant task correct. Archaeological confirmation of these practices arrived in the distant future through the extraordinary preservation conditions of the high Altai mountains, where several Kurgan burials, including the famous grave at Pazarek, remained frozen solid for well over 2,000 years after water seeped into the burial chamber and froze, creating a natural deep freeze that preserved not just bones but skin, hair, tattoos, clothing, and even stomach contents, with a clarity that stunned the archaeologists who eventually excavated them. These frozen bodies confirmed in remarkable physical detail exactly the kind of preparation Herodotus had described second-hand centuries after the fact, evidence and eyewitness account lining up with a precision historians rarely get to enjoy when studying the ancient world. The bodies recovered from these frozen tombs showed clear evidence of evisceration, the removal of internal organs that decompose fastest, and the packing of the resulting cavity with various preservative materials, alongside careful shaving or trimming in some cases, and, in at least one famous example, the stuffing of the skull itself with grass and other materials following the removal of the brain. The detail that sounds almost too vivid to be real, and yet sits there, thoroughly documented, in the archaeological record for anyone brave enough to look it up. Beyond preservation, this process also served an important ceremonial function, ensuring the deceased could be presented properly during the extended mourning procession, dressed in their finest clothing, adorned with jewellery and status markers, displayed with the dignity their position demanded, rather than the alternative your own instincts might suggest is inevitable after even a few days, without modern refrigeration. Cold weather, fortunately, does most of the tribe's work for it during winter deaths, but a death occurring during warmer months requires this more involved chemical intervention to buy the necessary time. The 40-day procession itself, as Herodotus describes it, involved carrying the embalmed body on a wagon through the territory of each allied tribe in succession, with the local population cutting their hair, gashing their arms, and mutilating their faces in mourning as the procession passed through, before it finally reached its home territory for burial in the Great Kurgan. Imagine, for a moment, the modern equivalent, a funeral procession stretching across multiple countries, each one pausing daily life for a formal period of shared mourning before the deceased even reaches their final resting place. An undertaking so logistically demanding that only a society with genuinely deep-rooted alliance networks and enormous collective commitment to funerary tradition could ever hope to pull it off successfully. Consider your own experience with embalming, a discreet professional process handled entirely out of sight by a funeral home, using modern chemical techniques that most people never think about beyond a vague awareness that it happens. Out here, the process is hands-on, communal knowledge, understood in broad strokes by much of the tribe, even if only a few individuals possess the specific expertise to perform it correctly. A stark, practical intimacy with death that modern society, tucked safely behind funeral home doors, has largely, and perhaps understandably, chosen to insulate itself from entirely. Let's talk about how grief actually looks out here. Because unlike the restrained, composed mourning modern culture tends to favour, steppe grief is loud, visible, and, frankly, a little alarming to anyone encountering it for the first time. Some accounts suggest that particularly intense sustained wailing during these mourning periods fell to specific women within the community, voices raised in a specific ritual cadence recognised instantly by everyone present as the sound of formal grief rather than ordinary sorrow, not unlike the professional mourners employed by various ancient Mediterranean cultures to ensure funerals. Emotional weight was properly, audibly represented. There is no shame attached to this practiced, almost performative aspect of grief. If anything, the opposite is true. A mourner capable of sustaining genuine, powerful lamentation for hours is respected for the depth of feeling and stamina involved, treated as someone honouring the dead exceptionally well, rather than someone whose sorrow is somehow less authentic for being skillfully, audibly expressed. Certain mourning customs vary somewhat between different steppe groups and sub-tribes, a detail Herodotus himself acknowledges when comparing the practices of different peoples he encountered along his travels, and your own family's specific traditions, inherited from a particular grandmother or passed down through a particular clan line, might differ in small but meaningful ways from the customs observed by a neighbouring related tribe just a few days' ride away. These small variations are a source of quiet identity and pride, a way of marking exactly which branch of the wider steppe world you actually belong to, even amid broadly shared customs that an outside observer like Herodotus might understandably lump together as simply Scythian. Younger members of the tribe attending their first full mourning ritual were watched closely by elders, not corrected exactly, but gently guided through gesture and example toward the proper conduct expected of them. An apprenticeship in grief itself that every stepchild eventually completes whether they feel ready for it or not. Herodotus records the specific mourning practices observed by steppe peoples with the kind of vivid detail that suggests he either witnessed something similar firsthand through Greek colonial contacts, or received an unusually thorough second-hand account, describing mourners cutting off a piece of an ear, shaving their heads, slashing their arms with knives, and lacerating their forehead and nose as visible physical proof of their grief for the deceased. This is not casual hyperbole layered on for dramatic effect. It reflects a genuine cultural understanding that grief this significant demands a physical toll matching its emotional weight, a belief that words and tears alone are simply insufficient to properly honour someone important who has died. You watch this unfold during the mourning period following a death in your own camp. Older relatives making small, deliberate cuts along their forearms, the blood mixing with tears in a display that would look, to modern eyes accustomed to quiet, dignified funeral services, less like grief and more like genuine self-harm requiring urgent intervention. Within your own cultural framework, however, this reads entirely differently, a controlled, ritualized and socially sanctioned expression of loss that every member of the community recognizes and respects, rather than one that alarms them, the wounds themselves becoming a kind of visible, temporary tribute, worn openly, rather than something to hide or apologize for. The specific mutilations follow recognized patterns rather than random impulse, And there is, even within this dramatic display, an underlying order to it, certain cuts reserved for immediate family, certain gestures expected from broader community members, a shared vocabulary of grief that everyone present understands how to read and interpret correctly. Someone arriving late to the morning gathering can look at the fresh wounds already displayed by others and immediately understand the scale of loss being marked. Information communicated through the body itself rather than through any words that might frankly feel entirely inadequate to the moment anyway. Hair, too, becomes part of this visible mourning language. Cut short or shaved entirely by close relatives of the deceased, a dramatic alteration to appearance that announces the wearer's grief to anyone they encounter for weeks or months afterward, long after any physical wounds have healed over. Consider how modern mourning customs sometimes involve wearing black for a designated period. A subtle, easily removable signal of loss. Steppy mourning instead alters the body itself, temporarily through wounds, more lastingly through cropped hair, a commitment to visible grief that simply is not optional or easily set aside once the initial funeral proceedings conclude. This intensity of mourning connects directly back to the broader funerary process already underway. The 40-day procession, the elaborate kurgan construction, the sacrificed horses and grave goods, all of it part of a single coherent cultural system built around the conviction that death, especially the death of someone significant, deserves an entirely disproportionate response by the standards of almost any other ancient or modern society you could name. There is no quiet slipping away here, no brief obituary and a modest gathering afterward. There is a sustained, community-wide, physically demanding season of mourning that reshapes daily life for as long as it takes to properly honour what has been lost. Emotional catharsis plays a genuine role in all of this, and it would be a mistake to view these mourning practices purely as obligation performed without real feeling behind them. The wailing, the visible wounds, the shaved heads, all of it provides an outlet for grief that some modern psychologists might actually recognise as healthier in certain respects than a culture that often expects mourners to compose themselves quickly and return to normal function within days. Grief quietly suppressed, rather than openly. Physically expressed and witnessed by an entire supportive community standing alongside you in shared visible loss. Consider your own experience of grief, managed largely in private, perhaps supported by a handful of sympathy cards and a few days of approved bereavement leave before the expectation of normalcy quietly reasserts itself. Out here, an entire tribe pauses, bleeds, shaves its heads, and travels for weeks specifically to properly mourn someone significant. A communal, physically demanding process that leaves absolutely no doubt to the mourners or to anyone watching about the genuine scale of what has been lost. It is intense. It is dramatic, and by the time it concludes, you cannot help but suspect that everyone involved has processed their grief considerably more thoroughly than a brief modern service, and a tasteful floral arrangement ever quite manages to achieve. Now, finally, it's time for the part of this story you have actually been waiting for, because in the days following a significant funeral, once the immediate mourning has run its course and the body has been laid properly into its kurgan, your tribe performs one final act of purification, and it involves a small tent, some red-hot stones, and a great many hemp seeds. Unlike the communal bathing traditions of settled peoples to the south, who at least have access to proper bathhouses and standing water, this vapor ritual represents something close to the only large-scale communal purification your own culture regularly practices, a dual-purpose event that cleanses both body and spirit at once in a single smoky howling session, which may go some distance toward explaining exactly why the reaction described by Herodotus sounds so intensely physically joyful rather than simply solemn. It occurs specifically in the raw, immediate aftermath of burial, timed deliberately, so that mourners carry the weight of their grief directly into the tent with them, and, ideally, leave at least some meaningful portion of it behind in the vapour when they finally duck back out into the open air, blinking, disoriented, and considerably lighter than when they went in. The stones used inside the vapour tent are chosen with real care beforehand, dense and unlikely to crack or shatter violently under the sudden thermal shock of the heated brazier, since a fractured stone sending hot fragments across a crowded, enclosed tent would turn a moment of communal release into a genuine emergency. Once the ritual concludes and mourners finally duck back out into open air, there is a distinct, palpable shift in the entire group's mood, exhausted, loose-limbed, and considerably calmer than when they entered, the visible physical evidence of catharsis having actually successfully occurred. Silence briefly follows the very first handful of seeds hitting the heated stones. A shared, anticipatory pause before the vapour fully takes hold, and there is something almost reverent in that short stretch of quiet before the howling Herodotus described actually begins. A small, portable framework of poles is set up, considerably smaller and more temporary than your everyday yurt, draped tightly with felt or hide to seal in whatever happens inside. And stones are heated in a fire nearby until they glow with the particular dull red heat that promises real intensity the moment anything touches them. Several mourners duck inside together, the tent flaps sealed behind them, plunging the small space into a close, dark, smoky intimacy that would feel, to a modern claustrophobe, uncomfortably similar to being stuffed into a very small, very warm closet with several relatives you have known your entire life. A bronze censer or brazier sits at the centre, holding the heated stones, and someone reaches into a pouch of hemp seeds, the same plant your tribe grows for its remarkably strong fibre, and scatters a generous handful directly onto the glowing rocks. The reaction is immediate and dramatic, a thick plume of fragrant vapour rising instantly, filling the small enclosed space within seconds, and Herodotus himself describing this exact ritual after documenting it through Greek contact with steppe peoples, notes with evident astonishment that the Scythians shriek aloud in their joy at the vapour bath, howling with what he describes, without a trace of irony, as pleasure. You breathe it in, this thick, herbal, unmistakably potent smoke, and the effect settles over the small huddled group gradually, a warm, spreading looseness in the limbs, a shift in mood that ripples outward from person to person, the way laughter tends to spread through a room once someone breaks the tension first. The stones hiss with each fresh handful of seeds thrown onto them, and the vapour keeps building, thick enough now that you can barely make out the faces of the people crouched beside you, everyone reduced to shapes and voices in the close, fragrant dark. This is not, it is worth being genuinely clear about, a recreational habit practiced casually on a random Tuesday afternoon. It occurs specifically in the context of ritual purification following death, a final communal act meant to cleanse mourners of the spiritual weight they have been carrying through the extended funeral process, a use considerably closer in spirit to a modern sweat lodge ceremony than to anything resembling a casual evening activity. The howling Herodotus describes is not simple recreational enjoyment. It reads, within its actual ritual context, as something closer to catharsis, an intense physical and emotional release following days or weeks of formal, restrained grief. Archaeology, remarkably, backs up this 2,500-year-old second-hand Greek account with startling physical precision. Bronze censers containing hemp seeds and stones bearing clear burn marks were excavated from the frozen Pazyryk kurgans in the Altai Mountains, found alongside the remains of the small tent frames that would have enclosed them, matching Herodotus's description with an accuracy that genuinely surprised the archaeologists who made the discovery. Evidence and eyewitness testimony aligning across millennia in a way historical research rarely gets to enjoy quite this cleanly. Further south, at a site called Jirzankal on the Pamir Plateau, wooden braziers containing charred stones tested positive for chemical residue consistent with cannabis that had unusually high potency, suggesting your people were not simply burning whatever hemp happened to be growing nearby, but were deliberately selecting stronger plants for this specific ceremonial purpose, a level of intentional curation that would make a modern specialty grower nod in quiet, professional respect. Further east still, at the Yanghai burial site, a shaman was discovered buried with a substantial personal stash of cannabis, carefully prepared and stored alongside other ritual and medicinal items, suggesting this was not merely a one-time funerary practice, but part of a broader, ongoing relationship between steppe spiritual practitioners and this particular plant. Used deliberately across a wide swath of the ancient nomadic world for purposes that were simultaneously medicinal, spiritual, and, based on Herodotus's own vivid description of shrieking, howling delight, genuinely enjoyable. Consider how casually a modern person might discuss recreational cannabis, dispensaries, edibles, brightly labelled products with precise dosage information printed on the packaging. Out here, the entire experience is stripped down to its most elemental form: seeds, heat, an enclosed space, and a group of grieving people seeking release together in the dark. No packaging, no branding, nothing but stone, smoke, and the shared, howling relief of people who have been carrying something heavy for far too long, and have finally found a way, quite literally, to breathe it out. It is, by any reasonable historical measure, the earliest clearly documented cannabis smoking ritual on record, discovered not through some individual's private indulgence, but through an entire culture's collective, grief-stricken, remarkably loud pursuit of catharsis. Let's talk for a moment about the man responsible for writing all of this down in the first place, because without him, this entire vivid picture of steppe life would have vanished into the same silence that swallowed most of the ancient world's undocumented cultures. Born in the city of Halicarnassus on the Anatolian coast, Herodotus earns his enduring title as the father of history, largely because of his methodology, actively travelling, interviewing, and comparing accounts from multiple sources, rather than simply repeating inherited myth as unquestioned fact. An approach that feels recognisably journalistic, even across 2,500 years of distance, however imperfectly he sometimes applied it. His willingness to include details he personally found strange or hard to credit, occasionally noting explicitly that he is simply reporting what he was told, rather than personally vouching for its accuracy, gives his account of the steppe an unusual valuable texture, part careful ethnography, part travelogue, and part unfiltered second-hand gossip from merchants who clearly enjoyed making their own travels sound as dramatic as possible. Herodotus's account of the steppe sits within a much larger work covering the wider conflict between Greece and Persia, and his lengthy digression into Scythian customs exists partly because Persia itself had attempted, and largely failed, to conquer steppe territory during a major military campaign, making these mysterious, mobile horsemen of sudden and genuine strategic interest to his Greek readers. A people capable of humiliating the mighty Persian army simply by refusing to stand and fight a conventional battle, retreating endlessly across open country and letting distance and supply lines do the damage instead. Earns exactly the kind of fascinated, respectful attention a careful historian like Herodotus was always looking to include. Herodotus's own contemporaries occasionally accused him of inventing details or exaggerating for effect, criticism that dogged his reputation for centuries, and it is a small, satisfying irony that this particular account, the one most likely to have struck ancient skeptics as far-fetched, turned out to be among the most thoroughly, physically confirmed of everything he ever wrote down. Herodotus, a Greek writer working in the 5th century before the Common Era, roughly contemporary with the very steppe practices he describes, is often credited as history's first proper historian, though his contemporaries and plenty of later scholars have also, not entirely unfairly, accused him of being history's first proper storyteller with a tendency toward exaggeration. His enormous work, known simply as the Histories, covers an ambitious sweep of the known world, but his account of the Scythians in particular stands out for its level of specific, granular ethnographic detail, describing everything from funeral customs to drinking habits to, of course, that memorable vapor tent ritual. You will never meet Herodotus personally, obviously, separated as you are by centuries and an entire continent, but the information he eventually publishes almost certainly filters through exactly the kind of contact points you experienced yourself with the traders visiting your camp. Greek colonial cities dotted along the northern shore of the Black Sea, maintaining ongoing relationships with steppe peoples, merchants and travellers carrying stories back and forth alongside their actual cargo. Herodotus likely travelled to some of these Black Sea colonies himself, interviewing Greek settlers who had extensive direct contact with Scythian tribes, and possibly speaking through interpreters with Scythians themselves who had reason to visit these trading settlements. His description of your funerary customs, the embalming, the 40-day procession, the ritual mutilation of mourners, and finally the vapor tent, reads with a level of specific procedural detail that suggests genuine. Careful eyewitness reporting rather than pure invented fantasy, even though Herodotus elsewhere in his work happily reports on considerably more fantastical elements: gold guarding griffins, men with the feet of goats, and other embellishments that modern historians read with considerably more scepticism. The funerary and vapor tent material, by contrast, has held up remarkably well against physical archaeological evidence recovered thousands of years later, lending it a credibility that some of his more colourful digressions frankly do not deserve. There is something almost touching in imagining this curious Greek writer sitting in a bustling trading colony on the edge of the Black Sea, carefully interviewing merchants and travellers about customs so different from his own Mediterranean upbringing, taking careful notes about a howling vapour ritual he almost certainly never experienced firsthand himself, and yet describing it with enough specificity that archaeologists working over 2,000 years later would recognise his account instantly the moment they pulled a hemp seed-laden bronze censer out of a frozen mountain tomb. It is, in its own understated way, one of the ancient world's great long-distance journalism success stories, verified by evidence its own author could never have imagined would one day exist. Herodotus was not without his own biases, of course, writing from within a Greek cultural framework that viewed steppe peoples with a familiar mixture of fascination and mild condescension, marvelling at their toughness and mobility, while occasionally editorialising about customs he found excessive or barbaric by his own civilization standards. Undiluted wine-drinking chief among his specific complaints. This tension, the genuine curiosity about a culture wrapped inside an inescapable sense of cultural superiority, will feel uncomfortably familiar to anyone who has ever read a modern travel account written with the very best of intentions and still managed to sound faintly condescending about the people it describes. Consider how strange it is that your entire way of life, one that leaves behind no written language of its own, survives in historical memory largely because a curious outsider from a rival civilization happened to find you interesting enough to interview second-hand traders about. Without Herodotus, the vapor tent ritual might have remained nothing more than an archaeological curiosity. Hemp seeds and burned stones with no clear explanation attached. A mystery rather than a documented practice. Instead, thanks to one persistent Greek historian's fieldwork and an improbable amount of frozen mountain preservation 2,500 years later, we know almost exactly what that howling, smoke-filled tent felt like from the inside, which is more than can be said for most ancient rituals practiced by cultures who simply never crossed paths with anyone willing to write it all down. Let's talk about hemp again, because before it ever became the star of a howling funerary ritual, it was already doing considerably less glamorous, far more essential work all across your daily life. The plant's long journey through history leaves an unexpectedly durable linguistic fingerprint behind it, since the ancient word for this fibre, filtered through Greek and Latin over the following centuries, eventually gives rise to the English word canvas, the sturdy woven fabric later used for everything from ship sails to painters' surfaces. A quiet etymological thread connecting the rope tethering your horse this evening to an art supply store shelf that will not exist for well over 2,000 years. Cultures further east, across the vast breadth of the Eurasian landmass, were independently discovering their own uses for the same versatile plant around this same broad era, weaving it into cloth and, eventually, some of the earliest paper the world will ever produce, a reminder that hemp's usefulness was never confined to a single culture or a single continent, but rediscovered again and again by entirely separate peoples who each happened to notice the exact same practical value in the exact same stubborn, fibrous stalk. Beyond rope and cloth, hemp seeds themselves serve as a minor but genuine food source in some steppe communities, pressed for oil or eaten directly, adding another practical layer to a plant already busy holding your tent together, and on the right occasion, filling a small dark room with fragrant vapour. It is worth appreciating just how much quiet, unglamorous labour this single crop performs across your daily life before it ever gets its moment of genuine ceremonial spotlight. A plant doing triple duty as textile, foodstuff and ritual tool without a single part of it going to waste. A length of hemp cord, tested and retested by hand before being trusted with anything important, represents its own small, unglamorous form of quality control. Since a rope that fails while lashing a cart mid-migration causes considerably more trouble than the few extra moments it takes to check it properly beforehand. Hemp is, first and foremost, a working plant on the steppe, grown and processed for its remarkably strong, durable fibre long before anyone ever thought to throw its seeds onto a hot stone. The stalks get harvested, retted through a soaking process that loosens the tough outer fibres from the woody core inside, and then beaten and combed into long, workable strands that get spun into cord, rope and coarse cloth. A whole parallel industry running alongside your wool production, each material suited to slightly different practical purposes. Rope made from hemp fibre holds up remarkably well against the tension and weather stress of constant use, securing loads onto migration carts, lashing together the willow frame of your yurt, tethering horses who would very much prefer not to be tethered at all. And this durability matters enormously in a lifestyle where equipment failure during a river crossing or a sudden storm is not a minor inconvenience, but a potentially serious, even deadly problem. You handle hemp rope constantly throughout an ordinary day without a second thought about the plant's other, considerably more dramatic application. The same way a modern person might use a kitchen herb for cooking, without ever considering its more exotic historical uses. Coarse hemp cloth supplements your wool textiles for certain purposes, sturdy sacking for carrying and storing goods, rougher garments for the dirtiest, most demanding chores where a fine wool tunic would simply wear out too quickly to justify the effort that went into felting it. There is a practical division of labour between materials here that any modern person managing a wardrobe of both everyday and special occasion clothing would recognise instantly. Sturdy and disposable for the rough work, finer and more carefully maintained for anything that matters. The plant itself grows readily across parts of the steppe and neighbouring regions, sometimes cultivated deliberately near semi-permanent camps or trading posts, sometimes gathered from wild stands that spring up along riverbanks and disturbed ground, and its cultivation for fibre long predates, by a considerable margin, any evidence of deliberate use for its psychoactive properties. Archaeological and genetic evidence suggests hemp fibre production stretches back thousands of years across various Eurasian cultures, a thoroughly unglamorous agricultural staple that happened, almost as an afterthought, to also contain a compound capable of producing the dramatic effects Herodotus documented so vividly. This dual identity, working fibre plant and ceremonial vapour source, is worth sitting with for a moment, because it complicates any simple, tidy narrative about why people started smoking hemp in the first place. This was not a plant discovered specifically for its psychoactive properties and then incidentally found useful for rope. It was the reverse, a thoroughly practical agricultural crop grown and processed for entirely mundane purposes for generations, whose seeds happened to produce something remarkable when a specific, ritually significant idea occurred to somebody, probably during a moment of genuine grief, standing near a fire, wondering whether there might be another use for the seeds scattered across the ground. Nearby, consider your own relationship with a plant like hemp, encountered today primarily through health food aisles selling hemp seeds and hemp oil, or through an entirely separate, tightly regulated cannabis industry that most people never mentally connect back to rope and sackcloth at all. Out here, the connection is inseparable. The same plant serving your household's most basic practical needs and, on the specific significant occasions that call for it, providing an entirely different kind of service altogether. Proof that even the most workmanlike, unglamorous agricultural staple can turn out, under the right circumstances, to be hiding something genuinely remarkable. Let's talk about what happens once the mourning, the mutilation, and the vapour tent have all run their course, because grief this intense eventually gives way, as it must, to the practical communal business of eating an enormous amount of food together. An entire horse, or in especially prosperous circumstances several, might be slaughtered and roasted whole for a particularly significant funeral feast, portioned out according to status and relation to the deceased in a careful, well-understood order that ensures elders and honoured guests receive the choicest cuts, while everyone present still leaves the gathering genuinely full. A logistical undertaking not unlike coordinating a modern large-scale catered event, except performed entirely from memory, without a single written seating chart or menu to consult. Gift-giving often accompanies these gatherings as well, small tokens of respect exchanged between families, a visible reaffirmation of alliances and obligations that the community will continue relying on long after tonight's fires have burned down to nothing. Since a funeral feast out here functions simultaneously as mourning, celebration, and quiet, essential social maintenance for an entire interconnected web of families who depend on each other far too much to let old grievances linger unresolved for long. Children underfoot during a feast are indulged more than usual, allowed to stay up well past their ordinary bedtime, fed choice scraps by doting relatives, and generally permitted a level of noisy, chaotic freedom that would be gently corrected on any ordinary evening, since a funeral feast represents one of the rare occasions where the whole tribe's collective good mood outweighs the usual careful discipline of daily step life. You watch the youngest members of your family fall asleep, eventually right where they sit, sprawled against an adult's leg near the fire, thoroughly unbothered by the noise and laughter continuing on around them. Leftover food from a large feast rarely goes to waste, distributed generously among poorer or smaller households in the days that follow. A quiet redistribution of abundance that reinforces the same communal bonds the funeral itself was meant to honour in the first place. The feast that follows a significant funeral serves multiple purposes at once, honouring the deceased one final time, reaffirming social bonds among a community that has just spent days or weeks in intense collective mourning, and, quite practically, replenishing everyone's energy after an extended period of ritual demands that have left the whole tribe genuinely exhausted. Livestock gets slaughtered specifically for the occasion, more than would ever be used for an ordinary meal, and the resulting spread represents a genuine, deliberate display of abundance meant to honour the deceased's memory and status. You take your place among the gathered mourners as meat roasts over open fires, the smell rich and smoky, considerably more generous than your usual rationed portions, kumis passed freely and consumed with rather less restraint than an ordinary morning, the mood shifting gradually across the course of the evening from the heavy solemnity of the preceding days towards something warmer, louder, closer to genuine celebration of a life well lived rather than pure mourning over its ending. This transition is not seen as disrespectful. It is, within your cultural framework, the entirely appropriate final movement of a proper funeral, honouring the dead by demonstrating that the community they built and belong to remains vibrant, resilient, and very much still capable of joy. Storytelling dominates much of the evening, the deceased's accomplishments recounted in detail, battles fought, herds built, children raised, elders recalling earlier decades when the departed was young and reckless in ways the younger generation gathered around the fire finds difficult to picture, laughter mixing increasingly with tears as the night wears on. This oral tradition matters enormously in a culture without writing, because tonight's stories become tomorrow's history, passed down and gradually refined with each retelling until the deceased's memory becomes woven permanently into the tribe's broader collective identity, referenced for generations at future gatherings by people who never met them at all. Music and rhythm accompany much of the feast, simple stringed instruments, drums, voices raised together in songs whose melodies stretch back further than anyone present can actually trace. And there is dancing too, energetic and physical, a release of pent-up tension that has been building throughout the entire extended mourning process. Bodies moving in ways that feel less like formal choreography and more like pure, uncomplicated physical relief after days of restraint. Consider your own experience of an Irish wake, or any culture's tradition of celebrating a life alongside mourning its loss, and you will recognise immediately that this particular human instinct, grief transforming eventually into communal celebration, runs considerably deeper and further back than most modern people realise. By the time the feast finally winds down, well after dark with the fires burning low and the last of the kumis finally exhausted, there is a palpable sense of collective release across the entire gathering, a community that has properly, thoroughly honoured its dead, and can now, finally, begin returning to the ordinary rhythms of daily life. Herding, milking, migrating, all of it waiting patiently just beyond the edges of tonight's firelight. Compare this to your own experience of a funeral reception, a modest gathering with sandwiches and quiet conversation lasting an hour or two before everyone politely disperses back to their regular schedules. Out here, honouring the dead properly takes days, involves the entire community, and concludes not with quiet, restrained departure, but with music, dancing, and enough roasted meat and fermented mare's milk to ensure absolutely nobody present forgets, even for a moment, exactly how thoroughly this life was celebrated on its way out. Now, finally, it's time to sleep, and out here, on a clear night away from the smoke and noise of a major gathering, that means lying back and looking directly up at a sky your modern eyes have genuinely never seen the likes of. There is no ambient light pollution of any kind for hundreds of miles in any direction, no streetlights, no glowing city skylines smudging the horizon, nothing at all standing between your upturned face and an entire uninterrupted dome of stars stretching from one edge of the flat steppe horizon to the other, dense enough in places that the sky reads less like individual points of light and more like a pale, textured river of brightness running straight across the darkness overhead. You have spent your entire life under this sky without fully appreciating, until tonight, exactly how much a modern person from several thousand years in the future would pay, quite literally, to see it just once. Dreams carry real weight in your culture, treated not as meaningless static produced by a resting brain, but as potentially significant messages worth discussing openly the next morning, and a particularly vivid or unsettling dream might genuinely prompt a visit to the shaman's tent for interpretation. One more thread connecting your ordinary nightly rest to the same broader spiritual framework that governs funerals, omens and illness. Without artificial light stretching your evenings artificially long, your body settles naturally into the rhythm the sun itself sets. Waking with first light and growing genuinely physically tired as true darkness falls, a circadian simplicity that a great many exhausted screen-lit people several thousand years in the future will eventually pay considerable money trying, with mixed success, to artificially recreate. Certain stars and constellations carry their own inherited meaning across your culture, tracked and referenced by elders who use their position to help judge the passing seasons and the right timing for major decisions like migration, or in some traditions even significant rituals. A practical observational astronomy developed entirely without instruments, refined purely through generations of patient, repeated watching of the exact same sky you are looking up at right now. You do not know all these meanings yet yourself, but you are absorbing them slowly, the way you absorb everything else out here, through repetition, attention, and the quiet, ongoing example of everyone who came before you. The very last sound you register most nights, just before sleep finally takes hold, tends to be entirely unremarkable. A horse shifting its weight, a distant dog, the fire settling, and there is a particular comfort in exactly that unremarkableness. Proof that tonight, at least, has ended the same safe, ordinary way as the night before it. Your sleeping arrangement tonight is simple. Felt mats spread on the ground, a shared blanket, the low murmur of your family settling in around the dying embers of the hearth fire nearby, while just beyond the edge of camp the horses shift and shuffle on their tether lines, close enough that you can hear the soft rhythmic sound of them grazing or occasionally stamping at some minor irritation. This proximity is not accidental. Horses represent your tribe's entire mobile wealth and survival strategy, and keeping them near camp overnight serves both practical security and, if you are being honest, a kind of comforting, ever-present background presence that has been part of your entire life since before you can properly remember. The equivalent of falling asleep to familiar traffic noise if you happen to grow up in a city instead. The sounds of the steppe at night settle into their own particular rhythm, wind moving steadily across open grass with a low, constant hush. The occasional distant call of a nocturnal bird, a horse's soft snort, the crackle of a hearth fire slowly working its way down to embers that will, hopefully, still be glowing come morning. There is a vastness to this silence that feels different from ordinary quiet, less an absence of sound and more an active physical presence, the sheer scale of the open landscape somehow audible in its own way, pressing gently against your senses even as your eyes grow heavy. You think back, drowsily, over everything the day has demanded of you, the milking, the riding, the endless negotiations with wind, distance and animals who answer to nobody, and there is a particular, hard-earned satisfaction in a body, genuinely, thoroughly tired from real physical effort, rather than the low-grade mental exhaustion of a modern day spent mostly sitting still. Sleep, when it finally arrives, comes fast and deep, uncomplicated by screens or artificial light, convincing your body that daytime has somehow extended well past its natural boundaries. Tomorrow will bring more of the same, another migration perhaps, or a day spent tending herds, practicing archery, felting wool, or simply managing the 1,000 small tasks that keep a household functioning out here without any of the conveniences a much later civilization will eventually take entirely for granted. There is no dread in this anticipation, only the calm, practiced acceptance of someone who has never known any other way of living, who understands instinctively that tomorrow's hardships will be met the same way today's were, with skill accumulated over a lifetime, family close at hand, and horses grazing quietly just beyond the edge of the firelight. Consider your own bedtime routine, blackout curtains, a white noise machine, perhaps a phone screen dimmed and set aside reluctantly after one too many scrolls through something that could easily have waited until morning. Out here, the ceiling is the entire visible universe. The white noise is genuine wind across genuine grass. And the last thing you register before sleep finally takes you is not a notification, but the soft, steady breathing of a horse who has spent all day keeping you alive and intends, apparently, to keep doing exactly that for as long as you both shall live. It is, by any reasonable modern standard, an exhausting, demanding, occasionally brutal existence. And yet drifting off beneath that impossibly dense field of stars, it is difficult to entirely begrudge them the view. And so, somewhere between the milking pail and the morning tent, the felted yurt and the fermenting kumi's sack, we arrive at the end of a very long day on the Iron Age steppe. It was a day, and truly a whole life, built entirely around motion, riding before you could properly walk, migrating before you had fully unpacked, grieving loudly enough that an entire tribe felt it. And finally, in that small smoke-filled tent after a funeral, howling with something that sounds, even across 2,500 years of distance, remarkably close to relief. These were people who buried their dead in gold and horses, who tattooed their accomplishments permanently into their own skin, who fermented their breakfast and bled openly for their grief, and who somehow, in the middle of all that hardship, discovered that a handful of hemp seeds thrown onto a hot stone could offer a moment of genuine communal release from a world that rarely offered them very much of anything for free. There is something quietly remarkable in that, once you strip away the smoke and the horse smell and the general absence of soap. An entire civilization, mobile, tough, and largely unwritten, figured out how to survive brutal winters and merciless summers, how to grieve properly and completely, and how to find, even briefly, a bit of shared comfort in the process, all without a single modern convenience standing between them and the raw demands of the open steppe. They did not have anesthesia, or antibiotics, or central heating, and they still managed somehow to build monuments, raise families, and pass down enough knowledge, oral, tattooed, and buried, that we are still piecing their story together thousands of years later. So tonight, as you settle into your own soft, unshared bed, in a room that asks nothing of you beyond simply falling asleep, maybe spare a small drowsy thought for the herders, the mourners, and the vapour tent howlers who came so very long before you. You do not have to milk a mare before breakfast. You do not have to bury your grief in your own skin. You just have to close your eyes. And that, historically speaking, is the easy part. Good night.